cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. The fire crackled as we sat in the front yard, the crickets tuning up and the little stream lapping at its banks. The snow melt had been thick that year. The small cold snap that we had experienced the first week of June hadn't hurt it either. I'd been living with Grandpa for nearly a year now, 10 months to be exact, and he had been making these bonfires a near constant thing ever since the first snow melt in spring. They suited me just fine. I'd been cleaning up the spring limb falls since April, and the bonfire made a perfect excuse to get rid of the limbs. Wait, you were just wandering in the woods and found a house? I asked. Grandpa snorted. You telling this story, or am I? I raised a hand in placation and invited him to continue. Grandpa did not like being interrupted. There was a little more to it than that. Wasn't you paying attention? I looked away sheepishly. I had been kind of hypnotized by the sounds of nature and had only been half listening to Grandpa's story. It was just so peaceful out here at night, with only the fire and the bubble of darkness around you. I liked Grandpa's stories almost as much as you all seem to, but I still get distracted every now and again. Grandpa settled himself again, giving me a look that clearly bemoaned the attention spans of the young, and began his story again. I was young when this happened. It was after my friend had become a tree, but before Grandma had begun to teach me the ways of the woods. I had started taking to the woods more often, not having anyone to play with much, and sometimes I would camp all weekend in the Appalachian Hills. My parents never worried about me. They knew that I knew the hills and hollers like the back of my hand. So when I kissed Mama goodbye one morning, my rucksack packed, she told me to be home by Saturday night so I wouldn't be late for church on Sunday. I told her I would and set out to camp in the woods for the next 2 nights. This was high summer, late June or early July, and it was about as hot as it ever got beneath the canopy of those trees. I was looking forward to finding my way to a spot I knew of near the creek. I could fish and swim and generally enjoy my time in the woods. When I got to the widow's house, though, I hunkered for a moment to make sure the coast was clear. Not because I was afraid of any widow, mind you. She was supposed to have been dead for a long time, but her house still remained, and you never know who you might find using it. This was just after the Depression, and sometimes vags and tramps would use the woods for long-term camping. I had heard of them robbing people, and worse, and did not want to blunder into a group of them who might be squatting in the widow's house. The widow's house was a bit of an anomaly in the area. Terry Manx, just called the widow by the time I'd come along, had lived out in the house till she was about 100 years old, they said. Her husband had gone to fight in the Civil War, leaving her and her son behind. He had never returned, and when her son had disappeared a few years later, the widow had been heartbroken. She lived alone in that house, but travelers said they often saw a candle burning in the window, as if to guide her son and her husband home again. It's said she lived in that house from 1830 until she died in 1910. The townspeople didn't discover she had passed until someone noticed that the candle was no longer being lit and went to check on her one fateful night. The man had knocked, and upon receiving no answer, he had gone inside to check on the poor widow. She had lived there for so long, remaining independent till the last, and it was said that he found her in her rocking chair as she sat before the remains of her last fire. The candle was frozen in her mummified hand, and neither decay nor corruption had touched her. She had simply dried up into a wrinkled corpse that had been buried in her chair, or so the legend says. As if taking its cue from its mistress, the house remained eternally. It had sat in that little clearing since her death, and no amount of snow on the roof or water in the valley seemed to change it. 30 years after her death, the roof remained on, the windows remained intact. The house sat like a monument, and it would likely remain to this day if it weren't for me. Now, I wasn't afraid of anything like that. Even so, you wouldn't catch me staying there after sun went down, tramps or no tramps. After a few minutes of watching the house to make sure it wasn't full of homeless folks, I went along and put the house out of sight and out of mind. I spent the next 2 days doing just what I had wanted to do. I fished in the streams and explored the woods and cooked my catch over a fire. Friday night saw a creature approach my fire that I would later call a moonchild. It had smelled my fish and came to have a look, but that's a story for another time. I don't want to muddy the waters too much, and this story is about the widow's house, and, more specifically, the widow's candle. So, Saturday morning dawned, warm and clear, and I decided to spend the day on the bank as I fished for some dinner to bring home with me. As I lay on the bank, pole balanced against my stomach, I found myself warm and comfy and utterly at peace. I could hear the birds as they called through the trees, and I could hear the squirrels as they played and moved in the brush. I heard the gentle lap of the stream and the splash of the small fish that swam there. Before I quite knew what was happening, I had slipped off into a nap and awoke to find the sun riding low and my bait all but gone. I judged by the sun that it was about 7 o'clock, and I cursed myself for sleeping away most of the day. I packed up quickly, but I knew I'd never make it home before dark. The sun was sinking even as I packed my things into my rucksack and started making my way home with all haste. I could hear the night birds beginning to tune up, and I wanted to be well and out of the woods before it got too dark. Regardless of my want, though, it was full dark by the time I made it back to the widow's house. As I got close, I felt like I could see a light coming from it. The forest is black dark at night, moon or no moon, and the light coming through the trees was like a beacon in the night. I thought about taking a wider trail around it after seeing the light, being sure it would be the light of a hobo campfire, but I was only 10, and I don't know a 10-year-old who isn't possessed with a wellspring of curiosity. As I got closer, I put my pack down and crept towards the house like an Indian raider on the prowl. The closer I got to the house, the less sure I became that it was a campfire. The blistering fire became smaller and smaller until I came to the edge of the clearing and found the source of the light. It was a candle, a single candle left burning on the windowsill, just as the widow used to do when she was calling her menfolk home. I hunkered at the edge of the property line, looking for people who might be hiding and finding no one. This would be a great way to draw in the curious, after all, leaving a candle burning on the sill, just like it says in the stories, and waiting for people to approach. You could hide beside the porch or even in the barn, and once you had them good and interested, you could spring out and have them. It was a great plan, except I didn't see anyone around. The porch held no hunkered brutes or half-starved tramps, and the barn was of the pole variety, and no hiding place there. They would have to be poor fellows indeed to hide anywhere on the property, and that just left someone in the house. I should have turned around and left, but I wanted a story to tell my friends when I went back to school next. How exciting it would be to sit in the warm sun on the playground and tell them all how I had seen a candle burning in the window of the widow's house. How they would gasp and sigh when I told them about how I had gone to the window to see who had lit the candle, and I could already see them putting their hands to their mouths and looking shocked when I told them what I had seen inside that place of bones. My curiosity wasn't the only thing that lured me to that house. I've always been a sucker for a good story, especially when it's a story I can tell others. But I suspect you've guessed that already. So there I was, standing on the porch with that candle burning behind that ancient glass window, gazing in on the one-room farmhouse that I suspect had once been considered spacious. I expected to see people in there, maybe even people trying to hide, and I kept myself low to avoid being seen. Inside, though, was very little to hide behind. A kitchen table, a few chairs, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a few bookshelves, and, to my horror, a rocking chair. A rocking chair with someone in it. The person was sitting in front of the fireplace, and I could see a dying fire smoldering in the grate. They were dressed in a long black dress, complete with a bonnet and everything, and a pair of knitting needles were moving slowly on their lap as they sat at work. The chair was going back and forth, and the whole scene was seeming pretty unreal. I backed away, trying to get back to my pack and get the hell out of there with my story. But that was when the door creaked open with a noise like a swollen hinge with a mouthful of rust. The voice that followed it sounded twice as creaky and just as spooky. "Thomas, is that you? It's dark, son. Can you come and help your poor mother?" I was frozen there, looking back at the door and at that raspy croaking that beckoned me inside. You likely won't believe me. None of my school friends did when I told them, but I was torn as I stood there with my fear crawling like bugs up my spine. On the one hand, the whole situation was just so weird, and all I wanted was to show my heels all the way home. On the other, this woman sounded old, possibly even infirm, and my mother had always taught me to help people in need. It was the Christian thing to do, after all, and as the creaky old voice asked if I was there, I took my first shaky steps onto the porch and walked into the widow's house. The inside was Spartan, but it was warm and dry for a house that had been empty for 30 years. I could now see why the vagrants liked it so much, and I imagined I could smell pastries and fresh bread as I crossed the threshold. The fire was warm too, and when the door didn't slam shut behind me to trap me inside, I felt that perhaps this was some old woman who had just gotten a little lost. "Thomas, is that you? I've waited so long for you, boy. Why have you kept your mother waiting?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not Thomas. I think you must be mistaken," I said to her, but she cut me off before I could say much more, swishing her hands at the candle on the windowsill. "Bring that candle over here so I can have a look at you, Tommy. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and it's so dark in here." I thought that was odd. She was sitting right in front of the fire after all, but I was too well-mannered to argue with her. I was becoming less and less afraid with every step I took, and when I picked the candle up, I saw the flame waft a little bit before it snuffed out. She tutted then, though how she could see that the flame had gone out was beyond me, but her words were good-natured as she called me to light it again. "Silly boy, you've gone and put out the flame. Come light it again so your old mother can have a look at you." I walked past her, her sewing needle still clicking as her old chair creaked away merrily. Bending low, I stuck the tip of the candle into the dying flames and saw it wink back to life. Then I turned, candle held out before me as I started to ask her if that was better. That's when I caught sight of her, and I came to realize why she thought it was so dark. The woman had no eyes. Her face looked like a burlap sack, like a scarecrow whose face has been drawn just a little too well, and as her toothless mouth grinned wetly at me, I saw the hollow pits where her eyes should be. It was the widow, sure as I'm sitting here, and when I dropped the candle onto her, she went up like a pyre. I stood in horror as she burned, her mouth open and spittily, as she laughed and laughed. Such a warm welcome for your old mother. Such a warm welcome. And as she croaked out her cobwebby mirth, I ran for the door. I could feel the heat behind me as the dry boards of the widow's house caught fire, but I never stopped running. I didn't bother with my pack either. I just ran for home, the image of that eyeless old mummy carved permanently into my mind forever. When I got home, my mother was waiting for me, all her bluster at me being late as I threw my arms around her. I never told her what had happened when she asked. At that moment, I was just happy to have the protective walls of her arms around me. I went back for my pack a few days later after school. It was exactly where I had left it, but I couldn't help notice the burnt-out husk of the widow's house. The house had burnt to the ground, nothing left but ashes and charred boards, and I never went near that spot again. The people in town thought it had been the vagrants, and I never tried to dissuade them of that idea. The children I told the story to never seemed to believe me, and I was always careful not to tell it to any adults. They might think it was an omission of guilt, and I didn't want anyone to think it was a fire I had set on purpose. The spot remains barren to this day. Nothing will grow there, and nature seems unwilling to come and retake the place. I've thought about going back there to pay my respects sometimes, but it's not a place I would ever want to return to. I think deep down I'm still afraid of seeing her there, toothless mouth laughing and sunken pits looking for her lost son. It's an image I'll carry forever. The crackling fire caught a pine knot then, and I was pulled from the story as I jumped. Is there anything in those woods that isn't horrifying? I asked, finishing my beer as I threw the bottle out into the woods. This was a habit I had picked up from Grandpa, and it seemed as natural as breathing now. Of course there is. You've seen some of it. But the world is full of dangers that, much like any animal, can be conquered if you know how. Your studies are coming along well. By the time you learn all I have to teach, I'm sure I won't feel so hesitant about dying. I patted his hand and said, hopefully we won't have to figure that out for a long time yet. He smiled, but I thought it looked a little sad. We can only... Driving a train sounds pretty exciting, right? It's really not. When you're taking your licensing course, you get a sense of excitement. You feel like you're part of a long legacy of train conductors. You imagine yourself dodging train robbers or having to solve a murder mystery, meeting guests for drinks in the dining car, or riding the trails to California or Texas. Well, in reality, you're mostly hauling cargo. Like many others, I found myself hauling freight cars through the dark at night. At this point in time, most things on the train come down to pushing buttons and trying not to hit people or things on the tracks. Run the horn every time you come within 100 feet of a crossing, make sure the tracks are in good shape, note any damage or signal malfunctions in your logbook, get to your destination and drop off your cargo. Rinse, repeat. I do the 6P to 6A run. Most of my route is done completely in the dark. The train rolls on while I sit at the controls, and Roger would take over every few hours so I can stand out on the platform and have a smoke or eat something out of the fridge we keep in the back. We don't haul passengers. Well, cattle sometimes. So there's no dining cars or sleeper cars or people besides Roger to talk to. After tonight, I guess I won't even have Roger. I'm pretty new at this, Roger having only worked here a few months longer than I had, and neither of us had any idea about track 54. All the tracks have mile markers, and between track mile 53 and 55 is, well, you guessed it, track 54. It runs through a deep stretch of woods, and the track is the only thing that's not trees or dirt for about 20 miles. It's a lonely stretch, and it gets a little creepy out there sometimes. Roger says it's bullshit, but I could swear you can see things in the woods watching the train as it goes by. The good thing about the woods is that they're only 10 miles from the depot we use to drop off cargo, so once you're there, you're almost half done with your shift. Tonight, though, tonight was a little different. I was sitting in the passenger seat, browsing Reddit on my phone, when I heard Roger swear and cut the brakes on sharply. I braced and looked out the glass, sucking in my breath when I realized why he had stopped. It's not uncommon to get stuff on the tracks, trees or animals sometimes, but this was definitely something we needed to call in. There was a body laying on the tracks. Roger keyed up the mic and called it in. "Engine 13 here on track 54.5, he said, looking at the screen, reporting a body on the tracks. The line went dead for a few seconds before someone came back from dispatch. "Engine 13, come back. Did you say a body on the tracks?" 10-4, human body on the tracks, said Roger. More static before someone came back over. A different someone than the young woman who had answered us. Is it living or is it dead?" Roger squinted at it for a moment. "Does it matter? There's a body on the tracks. It's the difference between calling the police and calling an ambulance, so yes, it matters." Roger sighed, glancing left and right at the woods before handing me the radio. "Keep these numbnuts updated while I go check what kind of body this is." Then he climbed out of the train and moved to the front of the cab. I could hear him calling the person on the tracks and getting no response. The body appeared to be sleeping there, arms and legs splayed out over the ballasts, but I couldn't tell if they were breathing or not from the cab. Roger didn't seem to want to leave the side of the train and investigate, probably wondering if this were a robbery of some kind. It's not as common as you'd think for people to block the tracks and rob a train. Our cargo was mostly cement powder or cinder blocks, maybe some quarried stone or various other things like AC units or unrefined oil. It's not really something a train robber would get away with easily. The handpiece crackled back to life as the older voice asked if we were still there. I told him we were, and that's when he asked for our location again. The way he asked made me feel a little anxious. He sounded relieved that I had answered, but sounded hesitant to have my location. "Track 54.5, I told him, eyes still on Roger as he walked closer to the body. Silence for a good 10 seconds followed. I watched Roger creep towards the man, almost comically. My eyes cut to the woods for a half second, thinking I had seen movement in the trees. Was it an optical illusion? The only light was the big headlight, and it made things in the peripherals look weird sometimes. Roger was nearing the tracks when the mic cut back on and made me jump. "Drive over it." I stared at the handpiece in surprise. "What?" "Drive over it. Get the hell out of there. No one's supposed to leave the cabin after track 50. Did no one tell you that?" I looked back up to Roger, who was poking the body with his foot, before turning back towards the train. "No, I've only been a driver for a few months. Roger and I..." But as I watched Roger coming back, I saw something long and white come galloping out of the woods and snatch him up. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It looked like a collection of white pipe cleaners formed into some kind of weird animal, and left in a backpack for a few days. It snapped up Roger in its mouth and was over the tracks and into the woods on the other side before I could get a good look at it. Roger was there 1 minute, and then gone the next. Engine 13, respond." "Something got Roger," I yelled into the mic. He went out to check the body and..." "Get that train in motion, now," yelled the man on the other end of the radio. I pushed the button, threw some levers, and the train started moving again. I heard the wheels tear through the body on the tracks, a wet and meaty sound, and soon I had it back up to 45 miles an hour again. I felt my breath coming out in hitching gasps as the forest careened around me, but the creature never made another appearance. I could still see that thing as it cantered across the tracks. I could still see Roger's face creased in terror as it grabbed him and took him off into the woods. I suddenly doubted they would ever find Roger, ever find the body I had chopped up beneath my wheels, and I knew there would be no sign of the creature at all. When I pulled into the depot an hour later, there were people waiting for me. People in suits from the Department of Transportation. They told me I had done the right thing. They told me I had been very brave and had saved my company millions of dollars in assets. They made me sign a lot of things and told me to take some time off before coming back to work, if I still wanted to work, that was. They advised that I not talk to anyone about what had happened and made me sign some papers saying that I wouldn't. Well, guess I screwed that up, didn't I? It's been a week, and I still see that thing when I close my eyes. I researched that stretch of track and the woods that surrounded it. There are more than a few strange stories about a creature that lives there. A hiker recently went missing, a man with dark hair and a thick beard who was wearing jeans and a blue t-shirt the last time anyone saw him. A man I would swear I saw laid across the tracks that night when Roger was taken. The line keeps calling to ask if I'm coming back to work. I just don't know if I can ever drive through those woods again. After someone sees this, I may not have to worry about that anymore. The four of us hunkered behind the fallen tree, looking through the binoculars in turn as we surveyed the cabin. The cabin that had been abandoned for as long as we could remember, and now suddenly there was a candle burning in the window. This had been a summer to remember for sure, and it would become a summer that none of us would forget. Richie, James, Terry, and I had been friends since kindergarten, and we had spent every summer playing around the neighborhood and having fun. This summer, however, was special. We were 11 this year, or close enough to make no difference, and some of the restrictions had been taken off of us. We could ride our bikes a little farther, stay out a little closer to dark, and explore the woods around our house, as long as we weren't in a group. The woods had been a source of restricted adventure for us, and now we were free to explore them as we chose. The first day of summer, we all met at my house with backpacks and camping gear so we could start exploring. Terry had paper and intended to make a map. Richie had brought some of his dad's tools so we could make forts or little bases in the woods. James had the nose of his air rifle poking out of his bag, and I had my wrist rocket hanging from my back pocket. We felt like explorers preparing to head out into the unknown territory, and we just knew that this would be a summer to remember. We began by exploring the places we knew in the woods, places our dads had taken us camping, or our parents had let us go to on our own. Terry made a crude little map for us to follow, and as the summer unfolded, the map got bigger and bigger. Soon the small camp and the creek were joined by the berry bushes, the big rock, the snake sighting place. We had seen a big black snake there, but it had slithered away, and of course, the cabin. The cabin was the oldest thing we had found in the woods. It seemed to be abandoned, but it was so well maintained that it had to be owned by someone. The land was well kept as well. There was no trail either, and the trees would have made even a small car difficult to get in there. We figured it was some forest dweller's summer cabin or something, and we left it alone. We had other things to occupy our time though, and the cabin was soon forgotten about. We spent the first month of summer building forts and making rafts so we could sail down the creek. We thought we might play pirates if we had a raft, and we started lashing some of the big logs together with some rope from my dad's shed. We made a sail from some old bed sheets. The raft was laughably small, only one of us could have fit comfortably on it at a time, but we still had fun imagining the four of us sailing up the creek to the small lake that led to it. On July 1st, the first weekend of high summer, we asked our parents if we could camp out in the woods for the weekend. We'd all been in Boy Scouts for a few years, and we'd all gone camping before out there. We felt that we could probably survive in the woods with some food to cook and some shelter to keep the elements off. To our surprise, our parents agreed, on the grounds that we did not camp too far in the woods, and we marked our map where we would be so they could find us. "No more than a mile into the woods," my dad had said, "and you make sure to clean up after yourself so you don't attract anything you can't handle." So we packed our knapsacks and prepared for a weekend in the great outdoors. We hadn't realized how close we were to the cabin when we set up camp, but when Terry had come back with firewood and told us about the candle burning, we had discovered that we were only about 20 minutes from it. We had all been sent out on such errands, and Terry was the last one to return. I'd been setting up the tents, Richie had made the journey to the creek for water, James had been digging the latrines we would use, and Terry had been getting firewood. It was getting on in the afternoon when he finally arrived, and the hot dogs in the cooler were calling our names. He dropped the firewood and told us we had to come see this. So here we were, watching the cabin for signs of life. Other than the candle, there wasn't much to see. There was no vehicle in front of the cabin, no lights on in the house, and had it not been for the candle, it would have been just as cold and abandoned as it always was. As it grew darker and no lights came on inside either, we kind of lost interest in the cabin and returned to our campsite. It had been a momentary curiosity at best, but our stomachs were grumbling and we were ready for dinner. As the darkness settled in, we had our weenies on sticks and roasting nicely over the fire. We had begun chatting about the adventures we would have this weekend, and the laughter around our fire was loud and merry. James had put some root beer in the cooler, and we were breaking out the Jiffy Pop as we prepared to tell ghost stories. Ghost stories were a huge part of any campout, and we meant to outdo each other with our tales of terror that would rival anything we had ever read. "I got one," Terry said, letting his hot dog slowly burn into a charcoal lump. "I read it online. This guy lives with his grandpa, and he said his friend turned into a tree." Terry laid the story out, building up as he told us about the kids exploring the woods and finding a special grove. We all listened, leaning in a little as he wove his tale. The story wasn't really scary, as much as it was sad, but the atmosphere of the dark woods made it all seem pretty spooky nonetheless. I was reaching to get a second hot dog, the first one having been eaten in 3 quick bites, when I thought I heard something out in the woods. It sounded big, bigger than us at least, and I took out the little flashlight I had and shone it into the woods. James looked up from spearing another hot dog, craning his neck to look into the spot my flashlight was illuminating. "Something out there?" he said. Not sure, but I thought I heard something." All of them turned to look, eyes peering into the murky blackness, but whatever it had been was either still or had moved on. "I've got one," said Richie. "It's pretty scary, though. I hope you guys can handle it." We all laughed, throwing a few marshmallows at him, before he leaned in and started his story. There were 4 friends out on a camping trip. They were staying the night in the woods, just their sleeping bags and the fire to keep them safe against the elements. Well, they felt all the night like something was watching them, so they decided to set a watch and make sure that nothing snuck up on them. They would each keep watch for 2 hours while the others slept, and as the others settled in, the first boy sat and watched that night. The fire crackled as we listened, and I thought I heard the snap of a twig again. Was something out there? Was it stalking us? It sounded big, but I suppose it could be a deer or a possum or something. The story isn't about him, though. The story isn't about the second boy either. This story is about the third boy, the boy who must watch through the depths of the night. The second boy had no sooner shaken him awake than he was curled in his sleeping bag and snoring happily. The third boy had slept for a few hours, but he was still tired. He didn't like staying up late, and was used to being snug in his bed when the sun went down. He sat by the fire, the warmth wafting up into his face, and he felt warm and comfy as he began to drowse. I heard a stick crack to my left, and I cut my eyes in that direction. Just then, something stepped on a branch out in the woods, and the boy found his drowsiness melting away. What was that? Some sort of animal? A person? A monster coming to eat him? The boy sat up a little straighter, but he was so tired, he could barely keep his eyes open, and the fire felt so good. I could see something out of the corner of my eye, but I couldn't be sure what it was. An animal? A person? A monster come to eat us up? He looked around, but he could see nothing. The small fire did little to light the forest around him, so he reached for more wood and began to build it up again. His hands shook with each piece he grabbed, and the coals danced as he slid the fresh logs into the flames. He soon had the fire raging, a burning pyre that threatened to catch the lower branches of the nearby trees on fire, but still, he could see only the vague outline of what stalked him. Whatever it was, it looked big like a bear, maybe even bigger. It had a towering presence that made it appear monstrous in the dancing light of our campfire. It appeared to be wearing clothes, but I couldn't be sure. Was that a dress? Maybe a robe? I couldn't be sure, but it was coming closer as we all sat raptly and listened to Richie's story. The boy watched the shape as it stalked closer, unable to tell what it might be. It was so big, it could be anything. A bear, a person, anything could be out in those dark woods. He took one of the burning sticks from the fire and held it out before him like a torch, trying to ward off whatever this diabolical creature might be. It came on heedless of the burning stick, and the boy began to scream as it stepped out into the firelight, and he caught sight of his stalker. This creature wasn't quite so bold. It hung back slightly, not daring to get close enough to be seen. When they found the boys, all of them had been killed. Of the 3 that had been in the sleeping bags, nothing was ever found, just a lot of blood soaked into the bags themselves. Of the watcher, however, they found him still at his post. He leaned in, the fire making his face look sinister. He was frozen in fear, his heart having stopped from terror. I turned then, looking over Terry's shoulder and into the woods, but whatever it had been was gone now. "Wow," James said, putting a fresh marshmallow on to replace the one that had fallen into the fire as he listened. "That was a great story." "Yeah," I agreed, scouting around behind him for shapes. "Bet I know who scared him so bad," James said, a little smile on his lips. "I bet it was Soap Sally." A chill ran up my spine. "Don't even say her name out here," I quavered, the others looking just as shocked. Soap Sally was not something to be joked about in the woods at night. Soap Sally was a local legend, a washerwoman who had done her washing at the watering hole for as long as anyone could remember. She made her own soap, made her own candles too, and was said to be able to make spells and potions as well. When she was found to be making soap out of the bones of runaway children, she was burned as a witch with only the briefest of trials. She was still used as a way to scare bad kids into doing what they were supposed to be doing, and there were still disappearances from time to time that weren't quite explained. I heard a rumor that those kids who went missing in the next town were taken by Soap Sally, James continued, clearly intending to milk the story for all it was worth. "James," I started, but I tensed when I heard a stick snap too close to our campsite. I heard she found them out past curfew and just snatched them up. They ran, of course they did, but she got them, one by one, and took them back to her lair to make them into soap. From behind James, a shape rose, a looming shadow that seemed to grow from the ground. I gasped, looking at Terry and Richie as it rose to 6 feet tall. Their mouths were hanging open, their eyes as big as dinner plates, and James clearly thought we were scared of his story. Then she hacked them up and boiled off the fat. She made them into soap, and then their parents found the soap the next day, and they used it to wash their hands. They never knew they were washing themselves with the bodies of their dead kids, and somewhere that old crone just laughed at them. As they mourned their loss, she laughed and laughed, stalking the night as she looked for more children to... But he noticed us crab-walking away from him and rolled his eyes in laughter. "Oh, come on, guys, it's just a story. Quit goofing around," But he gasped as her long black nails clenched his shoulder. When the monstrous woman bent down, her mouth of sharp teeth grinning much too wide, he began to scream like a stuck hog. We all screamed then, running into the woods like bullets fired from a gun. James screamed behind us, begging us to help him, but we were only 10 or 11. What could we do against something like that? We all stayed together as we realized that my house was the closest, and we ran for it. The moon was high and bright, and if it hadn't been nearly full, we'd have likely never found our way home. The woods we had so often played in seemed sinister, a child's fairy tale story, and we wanted to reach the safety of home before the witch could scoop us up and gobble us down. Every limb that grabbed our shirts was a witch's claw. Every hole that yawned to stop us was a hand coming up to catch us, and every sound was that horrid creature in hot pursuit. When we broke the tree line and made it to the row of fences that marked our neighborhood, we all breathed a little easier. My dad was having a beer on the back porch when we got there, and it seemed that Richie's dad had decided to join him since they were both childless for the night. It was only about 9:30, and both of them looked up expectantly as we ran in. "You boys get spooked by a deer already?" my dad joked, realizing then that we were one short. "Where's James?" I sobbed as I tried to catch my breath, and Dad must have caught enough to understand that someone had taken James. He got us all inside and called the police, Richie's dad calling James's parents as he did. Before long, everyone's parents were there, and the men had begun searching the woods. Dad wanted to take us with him, but we all refused to go. We'd had a scare, and when the police arrived, the whole group took to the woods to find James. They came back a few hours later to tell us that there was no sign of him at our campsite. "Is there anywhere that you can think of where he might be, boys? Maybe somewhere in the woods where this person might have taken him?" He said person because they had refused to believe any kind of Soap Sally talk. They wanted to keep this in the real world, and that meant that if a woman had taken an 11-year-old boy against his will, then they were likely close. "The cabin," Richie almost hissed, looking to us for support. "Remember? We saw the candle burning there earlier. Maybe it's her cabin." We showed them on the map where the cabin was, and they told us to stay here as they all went to investigate. They were gone for about an hour when I heard the back door open, and the 4 dejected fathers of my group come shuffling back in. They told the 3 of us to head up to bed so they could talk, but we hunkered at the top of the stairs and listened as they told what they had seen. James's mother cried a lot, his father holding her tight. The police were still there, and the sheriff had called in more deputies from the neighboring town. They were searching the cabin from top to bottom. They had found the door unlocked, and when they had gone inside, they had found that the cabin wasn't just someone's summer home. There was blood, so much blood, and the police had found the remains of children in that place. Bones, clothes, skin, hair, a bowl of fat that had yet to be rendered into tallow. The kitchen had several items for making soap, and they'd said the stove was still hot when they arrived. They'd found a shirt on the top of the pile, and James's father had identified it as the one James had been wearing when he'd left home that afternoon. They searched those woods for 3 days, but they never found James. Well, not until he appeared on his parents' doorstep one morning. I was eating dinner that night, still reeling from what I had been through in the woods, and Mom was talking about how wonderful it had been that the community had come together to support James's family. I went to take her a casserole this morning, and she was going through the gifts that had been left by the town. There were casseroles and gift cards and grocery bags and even a nice bag of soap from someone. My mouth went dry when I heard that, and I asked her what she meant. Well, someone had delivered a bag of soap this morning. They looked really great, handmade and so smooth. She told me I could have some if I wanted. I left it in the upstairs bathroom if you guys want to use it. My mom stopped talking when I started hyperventilating. I don't think the police took us seriously at first, but once they did whatever they did with the soap and found bone fragments in it, they started taking us a lot more seriously. James's mother was hospitalized after that, going into a full-blown catatonic state, and the search was redoubled as they tried to find the killer. That was a long and strange summer, full of curfews and lots of dads riding around on neighborhood watch detail as they took kids from summer school to home or to and from summer events. They never found the woman that took James, but my friends and I never expected they would. We never went into those woods again. It's been years since the campout, but sometimes I still look at the woods from the back porch and can swear I see the specter of Soap Sally as she looms at the edge. I graduate high school this year, and I think I might just get as far away from this town and my childhood as possible. I can't imagine raising a kid in a place where they can wind up as bricks of soap on your front porch. Frank sat on the front row as people filed into the little church. The tears ran nakedly down his face as the cheap organ played Baptist hymns off-key in the background. Somehow this infuriated him. He had paid a lot of money for his wife's funeral, and the least they could do was have tuned the organ before the service. It wasn't even that it was severely off-tune, only slightly. It was just enough to make the discord jangle against his frayed nerves, though. Derek, his son, didn't even seem to notice. He just sat beside him, dutiful as ever, and clutched his father's hand as the sea of mourners wafted past. The mourners. They were the other discord that jangled against his nerves. Ellen had been a school teacher, an English teacher for 30 years, and the crowd was mostly made of old students. Unknown faces, unasked for condolences, and always on and on about how good a teacher she'd been, or how great it had been to be in her class. Frank couldn't help but notice that for every woman that clasped his hand, there were 2 or 3 young men who were tear-stricken as they passed, bemoaning the death of their beloved teacher. He never said a word, only nodded as Derek thanked them, but deep down, he couldn't keep the questions from rearing up. How many of these young men had she touched in a more intimate fashion than through education? He tried to push the thoughts away, but they just wouldn't go. Ellen had loved him since they first met when they were 17, but after the age of 35, their sex life had begun to wither. She just hadn't been attracted to him the same way, and who could blame her? She had taken the baby weight off after Derek was born with incredible ease, but Frank only seemed to get heavier. By 30, his hair had begun to fall out, and the gray that threaded through what was left made him feel old. By 35, Frank looked like a man on the cusp of 50, and was often mistaken for Derek's grandfather. He laughed these comments off, but it certainly made him feel self-conscious. On the other hand, Ellen still looked like a girl in her 20s, barely older than her students. People always commented on how vibrant she looked, how full of life, and Ellen drank these comments in like manna. That was when Frank began to notice some small signs that his wife might not be faithful. She would meet students out in the wild, and he would see her lingering looks, the touches that lasted a little too long, the thinly veiled flirtation. He had brushed it aside as harmless. She was a teacher. There was no way she could be sleeping with her students. Then, just a week ago, he had received a call at work that changed his life forever. The nurse in the ER informed him that Ellen was dead. One of her students, an 18-year-old Adonis who would have put a Calvin Klein model to shame, had brought her to the emergency room after she'd suffered a major heart attack. She was dead before she got there, but the strange thing was that the boy wouldn't tell them what they'd been doing before the heart attack. He claimed it had happened at school, but she had been dressed poorly when she arrived. Her wedding band was also missing. The boy had the temerity to still be there when Frank had arrived. His condolences had been met with agitation and confusion. He had accepted Frank's impotent shoves, and when Frank had left much later, he had been gone. Now here he was in a coal gray suit, a look of most profound sorrow worn across his face. "Mr. Flossie, I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Mrs. Flossie was a rare gift," he said, shaking Frank's hand and looking wetly at him. Frank didn't have the mental energy to rail at him, and Derek thanked him before the boy went to seat himself. "Dad, if you don't think you can give the eulogy, it's okay," Derek said softly. "I can just give it for you, as long as you have your notes." "I can do it," his father intoned, nodding at a mousy young girl who tried to hug him, but seemed unsure. Ellen had always wanted Frank to give her eulogy if she died first, and Frank felt it was his sacred duty to fulfill her wishes. He would stand on that stage for the woman he loved, and tell them of that love. He would stand up there, cuckold's horns and all, and tell these ingrates about his great love for Ellen. It didn't matter that she had been distant. It didn't matter that she hadn't returned his love for the better part of a decade. He would tell them all of his great love, and they would know how tawdry her regard for them had been. As that damnable organ stopped playing, Frank heard the crowd's low murmur die away to a buzz. The pastor approached the mic then, and thanked them all for coming. He talked about how much of an honor it had been to have Ellen as a member of his congregation. He spoke about her works with the church and how she had never shirked her duties to God. She had been a Sunday school teacher for 2 decades, and her middle and high school congregants had always been happy to see Miss Ellen's smiling face. He talked about her time spent as a teacher, 30 years of teaching high school English, and the multitudes that she had touched in that time. He spoke on those left behind, her husband Frank and her son Derek. He talked about those who had gone before her mother and father the previous year in a car crash, her sister 15 years ago from a brain aneurysm. He was sure that they were having a joyous reunion in heaven, even as those left behind to mourn the passing of such a wonderful woman wept. Frank was no longer sure of any such thing. The Bible had very clear ideas about adultery, but he hoped that maybe it was so. The thought of Ellen burning in hell made him feel the same way that he had felt when he realized she was likely sleeping with her students. Sick to his stomach and sick to his heart. She had been his love, his only love, and he wanted to see her again when he passed on. He was no longer sure he would be given such an opportunity. When he realized the pastor was looking at him, had asked if he wanted to say some words for Ellen, he saw that those around him had begun to look at him. Derek had started to rise, figuring his father was in too great of pain to give the eulogy, but Frank lifted himself and put a hand on his son's shoulder. Even if he had been dying, he would have used his last breath to give this eulogy. He walked up the aisle, a very similar aisle to the one he had looked down as Ellen walked to him in her white dress so many years ago, and mounted the stage. As he looked out over the sea of young faces, he caught sight of something lurking near the back of the hall, and it made him shiver. The church was a sea of light, the pews sitting like islands in the swelling ocean of brightness. Near the back, though, under the second-story balcony, lay 4 massive pillars. In the shadows surrounding them appeared to be a group of people. They were numerous, maybe 30 or 40 deep as they clustered in the shadows, and Frank found himself thinking that they had brought that shadow with them. Weren't there lights back there? He should be able to see them, shouldn't he? Why didn't they come sit with the others? As the hush lingered on, and Frank did nothing but stand behind the podium in silence, he became self-conscious and put the crowd out of his mind. "Ellen was a wonderful woman," he began, his voice cracking a little. "She was a loving wife, a loving mother, and the light of my life." Frank could hear a quiet riffling of noise from the shadows near the back. It almost sounded like a low chuckle. When we met, we were both in high school, as many of you seated here are. Ellen was so vibrant and full of life that I never thought she would notice someone like me. When she came to sit with me one day, talking to someone like me and hanging on my every word, I felt like God had blessed me with her presence. The riffling was definitely a chuckle, a low, throaty surge of almost canned laughter. Some of those seated had turned to glance at the shadowy mob. The mob stood in tight rows, eyes on Frank as he spoke his heart. Frank felt that he could feel their smiles as they leered at him. Who were they? Were they from school? Why were they laughing at such a time as this? When we wed, I was only 18, and I could barely afford a ring. I scraped enough money together for a shoddy engagement band, wanting to propose before she came to her senses and realized she was too good for me. The crowd chuckled at this, understanding it was a joke, but the crowd in the back erupted into that tinny, canned laughter that so often accompanies sitcoms. The sound made Frank's skin crawl. She was my only love, and I was hers. The canned laughter hit a spike momentarily, and Frank felt his anger rising as the crowd mocked him. Hey, all of you in the back, this is a damn funeral. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this ain't the place. The mourners were turning in their seats to look at the crowd. To Frank's horror, some of them had begun to snicker as well. The row closest to the pillars was now full of smiling individuals, trying to be polite, but failing to suppress their grins or giggles. A redhead near the middle, a girl who couldn't be more than 16, was covering her mouth with her hands as her neighbor leaned forward to try to stifle his own rising mirth. The row ahead of them glowered at them, but Frank could see certain individuals having trouble holding it together. This seemed to spur Frank on, his anger making his face red. Shut up! Just shut the hell up! None of you deserve to be here. You were part of the problem. My Ellen loved me. We were soulmates, and the second row from the back had burst into the same mechanical laughter he'd heard at the start. Their individual laughters, hearty guffaws, embarrassed titters, were replaced by sitcom drones. The sound made Frank feel like he was crazy. The sheer unrealness of the situation, a funeral full of laughter, made him feel ready for the nut house. The laughter was like nails on a chalkboard. It grated against his psyche and made him feel like laughing and crying all at once. The laughter was the kind you hear in an insane asylum, the kind of laughter you heard in hell. Stop it! Stop it! Stop laughing at me! My wife is dead, and you people are sitting here laughing at me! Frank was crying now, big ugly drops rolling down his doughy face. Despite her infidelity, he had loved her, and here these people were, on the worst day of his life, mocking him with laughter that wasn't even theirs. The laughter had spread to the halfway point of the pews. Some of the people in the church, the ones not yet affected, had begun to edge towards the front as though the laughter might be contagious. They moved to the fire exits and windows, frantically looking for an escape, but no escape would come. And with the crowd of shadows guarding the rear exit, they were trapped. It's your fault, Frank railed at them. It's all your fault. I loved her. I loved her so much. But how was I supposed to compete with an endless supply of high school boys? How was I supposed to compete with your perfect bodies and constant attention? You drove her from me. You ruined our perfect marriage. You... Frank's tears streaked down his face as he found his son. Derek's face was racked with uncontrollable laughter. As he cast about, Frank could see others in the throes of that inescapable mirth. The boy who had brought his wife to the hospital was now doubled up with his head against his knees and a puddle of vomit on the floor in front of him. His handsome face was red and sweaty, his mouth laughing, but his eyes screaming. Others had fallen into the aisle, their bodies racking as they tried to draw breath amidst the laughter. Even those who tried to escape laughed, their fingers clawing at the doors, their hands banging against the windows, their bodies convulsing with alien mirth. On his knees, the pastor doubled up with uncontrollable giggles as he gasped for air and shook violently. Frank heard people retching, people falling, people kicking their legs and thrashing their arms in uncontrolled spasms, and as they laughed their lives away, the darkness spread. From his vantage point, Frank could see the darkness spreading out from the pillars. Some of those laughing were taken by it, their bodies becoming shapeless in the gathering gloom. It negated the light that usually filled the church. It negated the warmth and sanctity he had always felt there. Frank ducked and put his back to the podium when the darkness came for him. No, they wouldn't have him. This was their fault. It was all their fault. They had tempted his wife. They had ruined her. They had... Frank felt a snort escape his nose as he covered his mouth with his hands. His wife was dead. His life would never be the same. As the belly laugh bubbled up inside him, though, Frank realized too late what the rest had already discovered as he stood talking. He spent the last few moments of his life laughing into his palms. The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. We all tried our best to look appropriately terrified, but it was all mostly for show. Jesse liked to tell stories, but none of them were really that scary. The five of us were gathered around a flashlight in our bunkhouse, telling scary stories and generally just creeping each other out. Mike had a sack of junk food he'd snuck in, and Paul had a bottle of pop. We were enjoying just hanging out together more than any of the stories. These were the moments I looked forward to, the gathering of friends as we hung out for the summer. I've been going to Blue Lake summer camp for about 4 years now, and what I looked forward to the most was spending time with the friends I only got to see at the camp. Jesse, Paul, Steve, and Mike, we had all been going to camp for about the same amount of time, and we'd become fast friends. They all lived in different places and didn't go to school with me, so the only time I got to see them was at summer camp. I didn't have a lot of friends at school, so I lived for their emails and the summers I got to spend with them. "That story sucks," came a voice from the back. We all looked up to see the sixth member of our cabin, Terry Woods, as he lay under his covers reading a comic book. Terry had been coming to camp for about as long as I can remember. He was a weird kid who never really got along with anyone. He'd been through 4 different cabins in 4 years, and I guess it was our turn to get him. He was quiet, didn't really do sports, and just kind of seemed like a creep. He was constantly hiding in the bushes and making people feel uncomfortable, and the counselors had even caught him peeking into bathroom stalls before. They kept talking about kicking him out, but every year he showed up with his bag and a check, so they let him stay. It's probably the only break his parents got from him, and who could really begrudge them a little downtime? Jesse turned to Terry and fixed him with a frustrated look. Jesse hated hearing that his stories were lame, even though most of them were. "All right then, smart guy, why don't you come tell a story? Show us what a real scary story looks like." Terry seemed to think about it for a minute, before putting down his comic book and walking over to sit on the bed with us. We made a space for him that was a little too big, since none of us really wanted to sit next to Terry. He looked into the flashlight beam, and it was like being around a campfire. The light made his skin pale and ghostly, and when Terry looked up, we all sat back a little in surprise. He looked like a corpse, and he seemed to know it. "You guys ever hear the story of the Whispering Hole?" A few of us shook our heads, but Paul nodded. "Some of the older boys told me about it. It's a hole in the woods, and they say you can hear Indian ghosts in it or something." Terry nodded, grinning a little. "Legend says that it's not Indian ghosts in that hole. The story I heard was that long, long ago, a bunch of superstitious farmers buried their kids out there to appease a forest spirit so he would give them good crops." We all leaned in close now, expecting a good story with a lead-up like that. "They say when the land was first settled and all the Creek Indians were safely chased out of the woods, the crops began to fail. An old woman, whom the townsfolk suspected was a witch, told the people that they had angered a forest spirit, and now their crops would do badly. When they asked what they had to do to bring the crops back, she said that they must take one of their children for every year they had settled here and bury them in a deep hole in the woods. Only then would the crops grow again, and the spirit would be appeased." We had leaned in closer, our shadows magnified against the roof of the cabin. The townsfolk realized that this meant 8 of their children would need to be sacrificed. So through a lottery, they decided which 8 must be taken. The rich tried to buy their way out, and the poor tried to beg their way out. But in the end, those whose names were drawn were taken to the woods. They were led there by the witch, and some of the men from the village came along too. Suddenly, the ground opened up to accept their sacrifice, and they herded the children into that space. When the last one fell into the earth, the forest erupted in a mighty roar. The crops grew, and the town prospered. But if the townspeople needed to be reminded of the price they paid for their prosperity, they had only to visit the hole in the woods and hear the whispers of the children. The town is gone now, but the hole whispers eternally. We sat in silence for a moment, all of us looking at each other as the story came to an end. Terry had created something special here, but none of us believed it. It was just a story, plain and simple. Or so we thought. "Wow," Jesse said. "Gotta give it to you, Ter. That was a good story." "Oh, it's no story," Terry said. "The hole exists. I've been there." We were silent for a few seconds. Then we all began to laugh, thinking Terry was just making a joke. All of us, except for Terry, that was. As the laughter died, we all looked at his deadpan stare and realized he was serious. "You want to go?" Terry asked. The five of us looked at each other. Did we want to go out in the woods with someone we didn't quite trust and didn't really like? I already figured I knew how the rest would answer, but when Jesse spoke up, it came as a bit of a surprise. "Sure, let's go see this whispering hole. You're in, right?" he said, looking right at me. I surprised myself by nodding, but the other three shook their heads almost at once. Mike was afraid. "It could be dangerous out there. I don't think I want to go." Steve was condescending. "There's no whispering hole. Terry's just trying to play a trick on us, guys." Paul was sensible. "We should get some sleep, guys. Counselor Hank said there was going to be a big hike tomorrow, and we don't want to be tired for it." In the end, though, Jesse wouldn't be turned away, and I certainly wasn't going to let him go by himself. So, Terry, Jesse, and I snuck out of our cabin and trotted off into the woods with only the moon to guide us. "So," Jesse asked, "where is this whispering hole?" "Not far," Terry said, leading the way. "The camp's actually pretty close. It's about a mile, I guess." Jesse balked at that. "A mile? That could take us nearly an hour in the dark." Terry grinned that same jack-o'-lantern grin at him. "Then I guess you better start walking and stop talking." Then he headed off into the woods, and it was either follow him or turn around. At this point, turning around didn't seem like much of an option, so Jesse and I went. The woods were alive in a way that we had never seen during the day. I saw a pair of eyes looming overhead a second before an owl took flight. The crickets hit a reeing point that was close to eye-watering. The sounds of squirrels and birds were replaced by night creatures that were just beginning to come alive. With the moon on high and the wind rustling the overhead canopy, we felt immersed in an alien world the deeper we went into the woods. This was different than the camping we did. This felt almost dangerous, and it was exhilarating to three young boys in the woods alone at night. We followed Terry for about 45 minutes, all of us sweating and waving off the clouds of mosquitoes, before Jesse asked him if he was lost. "No, I know where we're going. It's just a little farther." He had picked up a large limb and was using it as a makeshift machete as he thwacked at the branches. I had found a stick of my own, a large one that I was using as a walking stick, and I saw Jesse looking around for a stick of his own. The way he was doing it, though, made it seem weird. He wasn't looking around in that lackadaisical way that kids look for sticks. Jesse seemed to be looking for a stick with a purpose. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Jesse started to answer, but grinned as he found a big stick that looked like a club. He picked it up and took some test swings before turning back to me. "Much better now. I feel way better now that I have something to defend myself with." "You hear something following us?" I asked, looking around to see if I could spot it. "It's more what we're following. I don't really know Terry. Do you?" I shook my head, ducking a low-hanging arm of a pine bough, and yet here we are following him into God knows what. "You buy a story about a whispering hole?" I don't know. "Not really," I said with a little shrug. "So then, where's he really taking us? Is this some kind of psycho crap? I want to be ready if it is." I realized that I had done the same thing without thinking about it, and tested the end of my walking stick against the dirt. It was a sorry excuse for a walking cane, but I supposed it was better than nothing. Watching the back of our guide, I suddenly wondered if we could take Terry if it came to it. Terry was fat, but he was also bigger than either Jesse or I. I had seen him play soccer once, and he seemed slow and easily winded. If he got his hands on you, though, I wondered what might happen. He could probably hurt one of us really bad, and then it would be up to the other to either fight him off or run for help. At a mile, I didn't like the thought of having to run all the way back to camp, but I liked the idea of running while Terry stalked me through the woods even less. It didn't matter, though. Not really. Once we came to the hole, it was all irrelevant. The closer we got to our destination, the quieter it seemed to become in the forest. The sounds of night birds and insects softened at first, like sounds heard with the TV volume turned down. But the deeper we went, the more they seemed to become actually silent. We were soon walking through a silent forest, and it made my skin crawl. Forests aren't supposed to be like that, and the idea that something actually lay ahead made me break out in goosebumps. What could it be that had scared all the wildlife away? What could it be, and what would it do to 3 kids who just wandered into its territory? Terry suddenly stopped, declaring that we were there. He stepped past a little ring of trees, and we followed him. Terry had the stick balanced on his shoulder, but when we came into the open space, he pointed at the hole with the gnarled branch. There it is, boys, the whispering hole, just like I promised. We turned to look, and I could see Jesse's fingers were white as he clutched his club. When we saw the hole, though, those fingers seemed to become boneless, and the stick spilled out of them. He stepped towards the hole like a drowning man paddling for a raft, and I felt equally as moved. The whispering hole wasn't a hole at all. It was like nothing so much as a grave. The grave was about 6 feet tall and 6 feet across. The earth had not been dug out, despite the amount of it sitting on either side of the hole. The way it looked, the earth had simply spat the dirt out like a mouthful of spinach to have its mouth free of the taste. The pit was deep, too, and Jesse and I bent over to look down into the black mouth of that chasm. The whispering was slight, sounded more like a babbling brook than actual whispering. Jesse made a rude noise, looking back at Terry as he rolled his eyes. It's just an underground river. You drug us all the way out here to show us an underground river? Terry shrugged, but his grin never faltered. It's the whispering hole. Have a listen. They say you can hear the voices of those dead kids down there. Jesse bent over, listening to the sound coming up, but that seemed like a great way to topple into the hole. Instead, I laid down on my stomach, putting my ear over the hole and listening to the sounds inside. I had worried about the edge of the pit crumbling and sending Jesse falling in, but the edge of the pit seemed to be made of stone. It reminded me of nothing so much as one of those random caves you sometimes find in Minecraft. Those openings in the earth that just wait to be found. I had wanted to see if I could squint and see the bottom, but it was too far down to see anything. I wondered how we were hearing the water when a voice whispered up into my ear. Beware, he's gonna push you in. I looked down into the pit and then over at Jesse, who was straining his ears and looking in. Who had said that? He's pushed so many into the whispering hole. Sometimes it's people he knows. Sometimes it's people from camp. But it's always him. Get out. Get out while you still can. I turned to see if Jesse was hearing this, but that was when Terry made his move. I looked up just in time to see him shove Jesse with both hands, sending him falling into the hole. I rolled before I could really think about it, and it saved me from getting a tennis shoe to the face. Terry was still smiling, but his foot was coming down again and again as he tried to stomp me. I was scared, moving purely off adrenaline, and when I sprang back to my feet, he lifted his stick like he meant to club me. He didn't say anything. He just ran forward with that gnarled branch he had been using to clear the path. I threw my own stick at him and turned, running into the woods as I tried to make it back to camp. I had to let someone know what had happened out here. I ran through the forest like a startled deer, but it seemed like something was stalking me. Something big was behind me, and the farther I ran, the louder and more frantic it became. I felt like Snow White as I ran through the woods, the once enchanting landscape now little more than a nightmare forest that grabbed at me with every step. The pine boughs whipped my face, the rocks and palmettos sliced at my shins, and the constant rustling of something behind me kept me on edge. Every time I would think about stopping or slowing down, I would hear it and it would pique my adrenaline again. I could have run for hours as I dodged the large something, but eventually I saw the familiar lights of the camp not far ahead of me. The closer I got, the more I expected that frantic rustling to crop up again. It had seemed to chase me all the way from the whispering hole, and I could just see Terry stalking me as he tried to stop me from tattling. What would he do if he caught me? Would he club me with that branch? Or would he just drag me back to the hole and toss me in? When I broke free of the woods and made it back to those familiar cabins, I felt blessed indeed. The scoutmaster came after a few minutes of steady knocking, and he looked grumpy. When I told him what had happened, though, he woke up pretty quick. He pulled me into the cabin and took my statement as he called the police. The police came and had me take them to the whispering hole immediately. Most of them looked like just regular cops, but a few had bags of climbing gear for spelunking. The scoutmaster and I went with the 8 officers and 1 dog, and as the woods got quieter again, I knew we were getting close. When we came into the clearing, I didn't see any sign of Terry anywhere. The guys with the bags looked over the edge of the hole, and with their spotlights, they found Jesse as he lay at the bottom. I was so afraid that he was dead, but one of the officers said that he was moving some when they shone the light on him. They told me later that we had both been very lucky, since Jesse had fallen almost 50 feet into the underground cave. Both his legs were broken, badly broken at that, and he had hit his head pretty hard, but he was alive. The guys with the bags went down to get him, a stretcher coming down on a cord, and when they got there, one of them said that they'd need some body bags after they got the kid airlifted out. There's about 6 other bodies down here, and all of them look like children. Most of this stuff the police either asked me about, or it was stuff that I picked up when I wasn't supposed to be listening, but it paints a pretty grisly picture of Terry's crimes. Well, not Terry, I guess, since there is no Terry. Terry had taken 6 other kids to the hole, 2 of them campers from the previous year, and just shoved them in. He had made up the story of the whispering hole to take other kids out to the spot so he could push them in and listen to them die. A few of the bodies had clearly died on impact, but the coroner said that a few of them had probably lived for a day or 2 as they sat out there dying. The sicko had probably come to check up on them as they lay bleeding to death, and it appeared he had meant to make us his next 2 victims. There's a manhunt going on right now for Terry, but the camp has relatively little information on him. The address they have goes to an empty lot in a trailer park. Terry pays by cashier check every year, and the phone number they have on file goes to a disconnected number. They've never met Terry's mother or father, and they have no idea where he lives. They know that he lives close to the Whispering Hole, but the chances of finding him might be slim if he lives in the woods somewhere with relatives. The camp has agreed to call if he turns up, but camp has definitely canceled this year for Jesse and I. Mom says I can visit him in the hospital if I want, and the paramedics told me that he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for me. So do yourself a favor, and don't listen to any stories about the Whispering Hole if they're told around the campfire this year. Terry will need a new hunting ground, and he may be coming to a summer camp near you. Have you ever heard the sound a scalpel makes as it slides over bone? If you haven't, it's a little like a knife scraping over a hollow rock. The bone isn't as solid as you might think, not as solid as the blade at least, and the sound has an eerie quality to it. The more I reflect on the sound, the more it reminds me of nails on a chalkboard or sidewalk chalk that kids drag over pavement. It's a weird noise that sets your hair on edge, makes you grit your teeth against the intrusive grinding. I've had a lot of time to think about that sound in the years following my wife's death. That was the sound that woke me up that night. It had been a long week. The department had been reeling over a series of brutal murders, and this was the first night I'd gotten to sleep in my own bed. I had been crashing in the break room, sleeping in my car, living one cup of coffee at a time while we tried to catch this sadistic son of a bitch. I know many cops in the same situation, but as most of us are locals, the desire to see this guy brought to justice was palpable. The killer had been sticking to a specific area. My area, actually. He was killing with no pattern, no particular demographic, but he seemed to be sticking to victims in this particular part of town. They were low to middle income families, people who couldn't just afford to up and leave because a crazy killer was on the loose, no matter how heinous the crimes were. And the crimes were particularly heinous. 7 different victims, none of them having anything in common, had been found with their faces skinned down to the bone and removed. The whole face. It was as though someone had cut the face off, skinned it to the skull, and took it with them when they left. Nothing was ever taken from the apartments. No messages were left. The killer never lingered after doing their strange deed. We called him a killer, but the victims were usually still alive when he left. They died from blood loss afterwards, sometimes living for hours, lying there as they watched their life leak away and screamed wetly. The last one was a store owner, well liked in the community too. The one before that was an 80-year-old grandmother. Before that, it was a 19-year-old girl who was popular with the boys in the neighborhood. A bike messenger, a beat cop, an aspiring actress, a high school student who was once a beauty queen. None of these people had even known each other. There was no connection between them except for where they lived, and no one could find a single person that any of them knew in common. The only connection seemed to be that they were all well liked. I had been sent home that night, Captain telling me that I looked like crap and I needed to sleep in a real bed. My wife had been waiting for me. Captain Weems may have called her before I left, and the night had been a good one. She had saved me some dinner, roast, potatoes, things I liked, and we had cuddled on the couch as we watched something on Netflix. As tired as I was, I remember feeling warm just the same as I spent the night with her. When she looked up at me, her head pillowed in my lap, I remember thinking I was the luckiest guy in the world. When I fell asleep after a rather heated session of lovemaking, I found myself looking forward to the next day, hoping that we could catch this guy and get rid of some of the fear that was hanging around like a cloud. When I came awake, it was because of the scraping noise. Some nights, I wish I had just stayed asleep. I lay awake for a few seconds, listening to the scraping sound and wondering what it could be. It was such an alien noise, like a nail dragged across a window. There was an underlying sound as well, a low, muffled sound, like someone having a bad dream. I rolled on my side, thinking my wife was having a nightmare or something, and wanting to comfort her. She was prone to nightmares. Her childhood had been less than ideal, and I wanted to wrap her in my reassuring arms. I found myself unable to move, though. My whole body was heavy, my muscles unresponsive, and all I could do was lie there and listen to her soft groans and husky moans. I was trying to move, but this was different than the usual sleep paralysis somehow. This felt like being out of my body, unable to control it. Then my eyes tracked to the mirror that sat atop my wife's vanity, and I felt a scream hang in my throat like a piece of meat. I was choking on the scream as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. It was a dream. It had to be. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. This was a nightmare. Maybe I was even the one making these noises that I was hearing. This simply couldn't be happening. I was dreaming. I was nightmaring. I would wake up. This would all go away. The longer it went on, though, the more I concluded that it had to be happening. The thing reflected in the mirror was nearly 7 feet tall. It crouched in the bedroom, leaning over my wife, as it slid one long finger over her face. Its head was large, like a big gray baby doll head, with the face covered by a grotesque mask that looked plastered on. There was a spread of red around the mask's corners, and it looked stretched and frayed as it lay pancaked across the creature's face. The creature's body was gray, long and disproportionately slim, on a pair of spindly legs that disappeared below the corner of the bed. What interested me most, however, were the long gray arms that ended in pointy fingers. Fingers he was currently sliding over my wife's face. He was tracing that long finger along the same track, again and again, and I could just see a trickle of blood sliding down one of her cheeks as I watched helplessly. I could see a trench working its way through the skin, the blood beginning to run more freely as he went. His eyes, his overly expressive blue eyes, followed the finger's path as he worked, and I tried with all I had to break out of whatever held me. The too big head looked up from its work, and I realized I was shaking a bit as I watched him. His hand stretched out, impossibly long, and one of those claws came to rest in my ear. It was cold and wet, like a fish that's been plucked from a stream. Suddenly, my shuddering stopped, and I realized why I couldn't move. This thing had done something to me, had done something to my wife. I was forced to lay there and watch as he went about his work. The process was not quick. Whatever tool he had at the end of his wrist was dull indeed. He had to make the circuit for nearly an hour and a half, and my wife's muffled cries were beginning to become more pitiful. The blood was really coming down now, pooling on the bed and turning the white sheet a deep red. I saw my wife starting to shudder, thinking she might come out of it. He touched her with one of those claws, though, putting the tip in her ear, and she went still again. I was going to have to watch as he took her face off. At some point, I think I realized that. All the realizing in the world, though, wouldn't prepare me for it. Finally, after what felt like days, he pulled the finger back and bent over her. He brought both hands up, 10 scalpel fingers peeling the face I had loved so much from her too white skull. That's the other sound I'll never forget. The sound of my wife's face being peeled away sounds like nothing so much as Velcro separating. I saw it in the murky glass as it came free. For just an instant, I could see the creature's face too. It pulled off the old mask, and I realized too late that it was the face of the shopkeeper we had found a few days ago. It put the face in its mouth, and as it chewed, I could see a face like a swollen potato, its mouth like a carved jack-o'-lantern sneer. Its rubbery teeth chewed at the flesh as those eyes stared blankly into space. It had a pair of way too expressive blue eyes, and for a moment I thought they might have come from a doll. They looked at me suddenly, locked mine as I stared into the mirror. Those horrible blue eyes held my gaze for a count of 20 before it slapped the new face on with a wet chuck sound. Those eyes stared back at me through the eye holes of my wife's detached face, and the creature went out through the window without a second look. Those eyes peeking jealously out of my wife's face were the worst part, and that face haunts my dreams every night. By the time I could move, she was already dead. She came out of it before I did, though. She lay on the bed, gasping wetly and calling for me. I didn't know if she could see me. Did her eyes still work? She passed out a few times as she tried to turn her head, finally just laying in her own blood and calling for me softly. She wanted me to save her, wanted me to wake her up from this nightmare. She couldn't be dying in her own bed after having her face cut off. I began to get some feeling back in my arms as her voice trailed away. I could flex my fingers, but my arms didn't seem to want to work until after she had already slipped off. The light had begun to peek in by that time, and I fell out of bed as I scrambled for the phone. I told them everything. I told them about the creature. I told them about its long claws. I told them about the paralyzing dread. I told them how it had taken my wife's face and left out the window. Their response was to send me to a therapist, to give me time to grieve, to have me work with a hypnotherapist, to try to decide if I had actually seen something. I quickly learned that they didn't want to believe what I had seen. They wanted to believe that I had created this monster from my trauma. They wanted me to believe it too, but I wouldn't. I suffered through the bereavement period. I went to the therapists and told them what they wanted to hear. They wanted to tell me that the creature was a way for my mind to cope with what had happened. I knew better, though. I used that downtime to gain information about the creature. There wasn't much to go on. The crimes had all been committed within 2 blocks of each other, all in a central location, all in the part of town that housed several large apartment complexes. I asked around, seeing if anyone had seen anything like it, but I got very few answers. Some of the homeless people told me that they had seen something skulking about lately, but most of them were too strung out to be credible. A few of them led me to an abandoned underground station that had once been central to the area, but now stood abandoned. The homeless didn't stay there anymore, and if they did, they stayed there forever, or so they told me. After a month of bereavement, I came back with the information I had compiled. I was ready to hand it to the chief, but I returned to a very different environment. No one believed that I'd seen a monster steal my wife's face. I began to hear rumbles around the station that I was a suspect now. A 15-year officer had just laid there and watched his wife have her face taken off. Not likely. It seemed more likely that I had been out all night and come home to find her like that. It seemed more likely still that I was the killer, banking on the idea that my reputation would put me above suspicion. I didn't care. I knew what I'd seen, and I took my information straight to my boss. My boss, however, was in another camp altogether. "Is this how you spend your period of mourning? I want you fresh, all this monster stuff out of your system. The others, they already think you're unhinged. The ones who don't think it think you're the killer. You need to be careful talking about this kind of crap around here. Get back to your desk. You're on light duty until further notice. I don't want another word about this damn monster. I seized behind my desk, already planning my next move. If it was proof they wanted, then it was proof I'd give them. I left early that morning and went to my home to prepare. I packed a bag, took my service pistol, and a shotgun from the hall closet. The little pump action fit nicely in my camp sack, as well as a rope, a flashlight, and some trail bars. I dressed warmly. The November weather was already becoming frigid after dark, and I looked back at my apartment before leaving, unsure if I'd ever see it again. I glanced at my wife's portrait on the mantel, though, and it was enough to send me on my way. This creature wouldn't be wearing her face for long. The old underground was a dilapidated relic, a toothless mouth that gaped out of the pavement. The gate was locked, but I had been told the fence was cut around the back. Some industrious vag had made a neat little hole to scurry through, and I entered the perimeter without much fuss. The sun had begun to set as I flipped on the flashlight, and it cast a red glow across the grimy tiles. The glow was gone after the second staircase, and I was plunged into true darkness. The outside had looked bad, but the inside was a ruin. The tiles had been shattered in places, light fixtures hanging from a leaky roof, and a single train stood like a hulk on a dead track. There was a constant sound of dripping water, a constant sound of scurrying feet, and it was easy to imagine that this was what Bilbo Baggins had found under the Goblin Mountain. I found myself swinging my flashlight around at every sound, my years of cool police training melting away as I descended into the station. Near the tracks, I found a handprint that looked red with dried blood. I jumped down to the tracks without a second thought, drawing my gun and looking right and left. My light fell across a fainted smear going left, light red staining the side of the train. I decided that was my direction. I moved quietly, not wanting to tip my prey off. He could have been hanging over my head for all I knew. If he lived here, he could probably see in the dark, and bringing a beacon with me would be as good as screaming down the tunnel. As I moved, I had little doubt that he knew I was here. The deeper in I went, the worse the scuttling and the skittering became. I told myself it was rats, but how sure was I of that? How sure was I that the scrabbling I heard wasn't the sound of those sharp fingers scraping across the ceiling? How sure was I that that scrabbling was the sound of those equally long toes, toes that I had never seen, gripping the pavement and moving his body along in a quiet scuttle? As I took another corner, I could swear that something big moved just out of my flashlight beam. I held it there for a count of 20 before turning away and continuing down the tunnel. The blood smears were all gone now, but I felt drawn deeper in as I took turns at random. It was almost as if I could hear my wife's voice calling me, and I had little doubt that he knew I was there now. I had even less doubt when he fell on my back, slamming my head down on the floor and sending my gun spinning out of my hand. I blacked out, and when I came to, I really wished I had died. I was laid across a metal bench somewhere deep in the tunnel. An eerie light lit the space, some kind of plant life maybe, and I found that I was paralyzed again. That was when my wife's face, a face made terrible by those two expressive eyes, loomed over me, and I'd have cringed away if I'd been able to move at all. It studied me, maybe it even recognized me, but its regard was terrible, as it came from a face I had loved so much. Her face was decomposed, rotting away as it clung to the creature's skull, and I felt something goopy fall onto my cheek as he leaned close to inspect me. I had only thought it couldn't get any worse. That was when he pressed that finger to the cleft in my chin. He began to circle, the claw digging against my skin as he slid the nail around and around and around my face. It didn't hurt at first. At first, it was little more than a discomfort, and I began to wonder how long he had been carving at my wife before I woke up. I stared at him, and he stared back, those baby blue eyes boring into me. His eyes were mesmerizing, terrifying, as they held unwaveringly still. As the minutes stretched into hours, I began to feel my face heating up. It was subtle at first, just a little warmth around my chin and forehead, but as the circling finger went round and round and around. I felt like someone was holding a lighter on my skin. I would have screamed, my flesh becoming seared, but I couldn't move, and my horror was trapped in my throat. I started to feel the blood as it slid down my cheek. First, it was just a trickle, a damp line or two, but soon it ran in rivulets. Soon I could feel my flesh parting from my skull. Soon I could feel that sizzling heat as it cut my skin, and I felt as though I might pass out. I had to. I must black out from this shock. There was no way that everyone was awake as he cut their living face from their body. It was impossible. It was sick. It was... He pulled the finger back suddenly, and I realized with real horror what was about to happen. All 10 fingers gripped my flesh, and I tried to pull away. Maybe I could still make it to a hospital. They could fix me. They could make this right. There was no way he was going to take my face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. It wasn't supposed to... He gripped my face, and I heard that same Velcro ripping as my own skin came free of my skull. Then he devoured my wife's face as I watched, and slapped my own across the gore-soaked canvas that was his lumpy head. He hooted then. Hooted and cried in a strange, unknowable language. He turned to a deeper tunnel and cried out in pure pleasure as he fulfilled whatever ritual he was performing, whatever dark spell he needed these faces for. I hoped he would let me go now. I had lost a lot of blood, but maybe I could still get some medical attention. I felt groggy, but when I heard something struggling out of the depths of the tunnel, I felt something heavy settle into my guts. What fresh hell was this? Out of the darkness, lit only by whatever phosphorescence dwelled down here, came a hulking thing that slid on long gray limbs. It was spider-like, a massive gray blob that pulled itself along on something like tentacles. Each of them ended in the same hooked fingers as the creature. It lowered its equally mushy face to the creature, taking in the face he now wore, and I heard something speak in a voice made of broken glass. "Do's it please, oo mother? Do I please, oo mother?" it cried, and that voice was full of hope and terrible longing. The gray creature leaned in, seemed to contemplate for a long moment, before it opened its shapeless mouth and whispered a single horrible word in a language like snakes crawling across my naked face. "Ugly." Then it pulled itself back into the depths, and I heard the creature sobbing as it fell to its gray knees and wept. Then, suddenly I was running. My mind had set itself to autopilot, and my body and mind just couldn't take it anymore. Myself pushed against this thing and its terrible need, and my body propelled itself away before this knowledge could do my brain lasting harm. I ran and ran, blind in that lightless world, as the blood leaked down my naked face. If the creature came after me, then I never knew. If the thing that wore my face came after me, I never knew. I was running one second, the darkness pressing in all around me, and the next my world was full of light, and I was falling into oblivion. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, being told just how lucky I was to be alive. An undercover cop had followed me to the underground entrance, and had waited to question me when I came back out. When I didn't come out for several hours, he called in people to look for me. Those people had heard me screaming through the tunnels, caught sight of my faceless form in their flashlights, and caught me just before I fell. I had nearly died on the way here. I had simply lost too much blood, and my body was in some kind of shock. They had sedated me, my night terrors causing me to buck and scream, and I had spent nearly a week in the hospital bed. No one thinks I'm crazy anymore. No one thinks I'm the killer anymore. Certainly, no one believes I cut my own damn face off. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone living in the area. Get out. Leave your home and get out. The creature has no rhyme or reason for his actions. He seeks only to gain something that I believe he will never find. I'm safe now, a faceless horror who will have to live his life with the knowledge I discovered under the city that day. But you needn't suffer my fate. Get away from the cheap side. Get away from the concrete apartments. Get as far from the city as you can, lest you be one more face for this monster to show his mother. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Well, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Xaronana and Emily Coltsfoot for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks to you all. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the show, I always recommend you come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can join our Spooky Skeleton army and have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video. Patrons also get to suggest a story for my Monday stories and get their stories on Tuesday and Thursday. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and find out what all the fuss is about. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I highly recommend that you hit that subscribe button and that bell so you don't miss any of the spooky tales we do here, and maybe leave a comment. The algorithm, and me, always likes when you leave a little comment. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening. None of us believed him. How could we? It was just so odd that it couldn't be true. I swear to you that it happened. I can't prove it, but I swear to you it happened. We all just kind of shook our heads, but the look on Roger's face should have been proof enough that he was serious. He just looked so haunted, like he'd seen something that would never leave him. Roger's a habitual drunk. He manages it well for work, but he's been a drunk since I met him in college. Not a social drinker, or a fun drunk either, but a hardcore alcoholic. Like I said, he keeps it under control so he can hold a job down, but from quitting time till he passes out, Roger is drunk and in his own world. The story he told us happened in the park last night, and the way he told it made me think that while he was telling it, he might be stone sober. Roger had been off that day, so, of course, he's headed straight down to McGrady's at 11 just as the other day drinkers were starting to sober up. He drank his lunch, met us for shots after Ryan and I got off work, and then left about 8 when the bartender told him to stop smacking the jukebox or get the hell out. Roger, very drunk at this point, had staggered out and gone to the park across the way. He intended to sit for a minute and wait for his head to stop spinning long enough to pick up a fresh bottle and start drinking at home. I was sitting on the bench near the little pond, you know, the one across from the hollow oak tree. I had nodded, knowing just what he was talking about. The hollow oak is kind of a landmark in the town. Guys from the agricultural college had tested it a few years ago and determined that it was 80% hollow on the inside. They were at a loss to say how it stayed in the ground, but it did, and people sometimes came to take pictures. The city had set up a little chain perimeter around it, and you weren't supposed to touch it or disturb it in any way. So I'm sitting there, watching the sun go down, and night begins to settle, when I see this guy come out of the tree. We had asked him if he meant someone had been, you know, up in the tree or leaning against the base of the tree. But Roger just shook his head and repeated that the guy had been inside the tree. It's like he had floundered with his words for a minute before settling on, you remember when you were a kid and you played with Play-Doh? You had that thing that would squeeze the clay through a little hole and make, like, spaghetti or something? Well, it was kind of like that, except way worse. He said it had started with an arm. At first, Roger had just thought it might be a squirrel or a bird, but when the finger gripped the bark, he began to think he might be hallucinating. The arm pulled its way out of the knothole, and pretty soon, a pale shoulder was sticking out too. The shoulder stretched and turned, and when a head followed, Roger said he almost screamed. He was certain he was hallucinating then, sure that the sauce had finally cooked his brain, but he doubted even his mind could create something like this. The tree pushed the person out, head and shoulders, knees and toes, and the man had hit the ground on all fours like some kind of spider. He scuttled across the grass under the chain. When he got to the edge of the barrier, he started making gagging noises. As Roger watched, the man had thrown up a dozen small somethings and then scuttled to the other corner of the barricade to do it again. He had done this 3 more times, upchucking into each, and when he looked up from the 4th round, he had made eye contact with Roger. The man's face, he said, had been confused but not afraid. He was looking at something unfamiliar, and when he smiled, Roger felt his breath catch in his throat. The man's teeth were pointed like a bunch of sewing needles, and the look had been far bigger than Roger's pickled brain could understand. The smile looked painful, too big, like he could have swallowed me whole. Roger had run then, run all the way home. That's where we'd found him last night, passed out on the floor and mumbling in his sleep. I finished my coffee and told Roger that he better get ready if he wanted to ride to work. Roger said he wasn't going in today, though. He'd told the boss he didn't feel well, and I told him I'd meet him at McGrady's after work. He had shaken his head at me, mumbling about how he'd never go back in that bar again. I think I might be done with the sauce for a while, he said, his voice shaking like a leaf. I rolled my eyes and left for work, expecting I'd find him drunk when I got to the bar that night. When I got to the bar at 6 o'clock, though, he was nowhere to be seen. The bartender said he hadn't seen him all day, but asked me to remind him that his tab still needed settling. I asked a few of the regulars, and they said they hadn't seen him either, so I stepped out of McGrady's and found a familiar shape sitting in the park. I walked up to Roger and found him stone sober, sitting on the same park bench he had told me about in his story. "Have you been here all day?" I asked. Roger nodded as he stared at the tree. I had never seen Roger this way, and it kind of scared me. I'd seen him sober before, and I'd seen him drunk plenty of times, but this was different. He was like a different person, someone who's seen something he can't comprehend, and I felt sorry for whatever it was that was going on inside his head. "You were serious about that thing, weren't you?" I asked. Roger nodded, his eyes boring into the tree like he meant to melt it. I wanted to walk away, but I found myself sitting down beside him instead. My morbid curiosity had gotten the better of me, and if this creature was real, then I wanted to see it myself. So, we sat like watchers in a theater, waiting for the show to begin. It wasn't a short sit either. 6 became 7, 7 became 8, and 8 became 8:30 as we sat watching the sun sink lower and lower. It was high summer, and the days were long. Just before 8:30, the sun became a burning coal on the horizon, and the two of us tensed for what might or might not be about to happen. As the darkness settled over us, I sighed. "Good one, Roger. Got me to waste my whole afternoon on this nonsense. Come on, I'll buy you a drink, and you can have a good laugh at me about how you—" But he grabbed my arm then, pointing at the tree with a shaky hand. I looked back, and a long pink worm was beginning to make its way out of the knothole. "It's just a worm, Roger. You got drunk and hallucinated something that scared you. I'm glad you're using it as an excuse to get sober, but don't ask me to buy into your delusion." "Does that look like a worm to you?" he asked, his voice shaking. I glanced back and saw that it indeed no longer resembled a worm. The one worm had become 5, and they were attached to a pale pink hand. The hand had unfurled from the hole like an alien flower, and as the wrist made its way out, I realized that the show had begun. The wrist emerged, and behind it came an arm and an elbow. The shoulder was next, and as the tree sprouted a man, I found myself unable to look away. He came slithering from the knothole, this boneless creature in human flesh. It was like watching dough being pushed through a press, and I wondered how it could possibly do this. When his head came free, it looked like nothing so much as a helium balloon being inflated. "How?" I gibbered, my mind refusing to understand what it was seeing. "How can this be?" If Roger knew, he never answered. The two of us sat mesmerized as we watched this fully grown man come slithering from a gnarled hole too small for a squirrel to fit into. He hung from the opening when it was down to his legs, a caterpillar ready to slide from his cocoon, and he hit the ground on his back before flipping over gracefully and scuttling on all fours towards the chain-link fence. When he opened his mouth, a spray of small somethings came spilling out onto the ground. They were black, looking like the smooth river stones you sometimes buy at a hobby store. He threw up about 20 of them before scuttling to the other corner. He repeated this operation 4 times, and as he opened his mouth for the 4th time, I saw the double row of pointed teeth in his oddly large mouth. He looked up after seeing us, and just as Roger had said, he smiled before scuttling back into his tree and pressing himself back into the hole. It was like watching a blow-up doll deflate in slow motion. First his arms, then his shoulders, then his head, then his legs. Before long, his feet were disappearing grotesquely back into the cramped little opening. By the time he was done, it was almost 9, and I felt as though my brain had been awake for days. That probably sounds weird, but when you see something like that, something that just doesn't make sense, your brain tries its best to make it fit into the picture of the world you know. Birds fly, fish swim, and this man compresses himself in and out of a tree so he can throw up. I stood up then, and Roger grabbed my arm. "Don't do it. If you look, you won't be able to stop yourself." I pulled myself away from him, wanting to see what it was. I needed to know. Why did he come out to throw these things up? Were they bugs that were killing the tree? Were they some kind of sickness he had to keep purging? Why did this thing that defied logic come out of this tree just to throw up these whatever they were? I bent down, taking out my phone as I shone a light on the pile closest to us. I gasped. I couldn't help myself. They were acorns. Solid black acorns that were about 2 sizes too large to be a normal acorn. I reached down to pick one up, but my hand froze before I could touch it. I stood up, wiping my hand despite it having touched nothing, and offered to buy Roger a drink anyway. After what we had seen, I thought we both probably needed one. "No thanks. I think I'm done with drinking for a while. Maybe you ought to come home too," he offered. We ended up heading home and just watching TV for the rest of the night. Roger hasn't had a drop of alcohol in a month, and I still find myself dreaming about that strange creature once or twice a week. It'll fade in time, but I want to get it down here so other people know. Given what happened yesterday, it's information that people might need. You see, the news reported that the Hollow Oak had gone. No one had seen it go, but the patrons of Mrcreepypasta's had speculated that it must have been between midnight and 5 a.m. when the bar closed. Many of them had seen the old tree when they came inside, but reported that it was gone when they left at 5 a.m. after last call. But never fear, local botanists have reported that a small sapling has already sprouted in the spot its predecessor occupied. There's no evidence to suggest it might also be a hollow oak, but this reporter certainly hopes so, the man on the TV had said. I'd like to say this is where it ends, but unfortunately, there's a little more. You see, I couldn't get those strange acorns out of my head. I kept thinking about them, wondering about them. So the night before the hollow oak left, I went and watched the man as he went about his strange and disgusting ritual. Once he had gone back inside his tree, I went to the pile and took one. I put it in my jacket pocket, and now it's sitting on my desk. It seems to draw my eye, the little acorn almost appearing to beat like an infected heart. And my mind tells me to plant it in the ground. Roger told me that if I touched it, I wouldn't be able to help myself. And I guess he was right. I don't know how much longer I can stop myself from planting this thing, but I fear what might come tumbling out one night if it grows. So if the hollow oak should happen to land in your town, don't touch its strange occupant's acorns if he should come out to deposit them. I wouldn't interrupt his strange ritual either, not if I were you. The occupant seems harmless, but those teeth must be for eating something. "Hey, Four Eyes," Marcus yelled, and I winced as I heard his sneakers smacking the linoleum. Marcus and I are far from friends. I've known Marcus since my family moved here when I was 8. My first interaction with him was on the playground on my first day of school. Marcus and his small band of cronies wandered up to me as I sat in the sandbox, clearly drawn over by the new kid, and made the dynamic of our future relationship very clear. I had sand kicked in my face, a sneaker pressed to my chest, and before I knew it, I was on my back in the sandbox, as Marcus informed me that he would be collecting my lunch money from now on, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it. As I lay there staring up at him, without a teacher in sight to help me, I knew at 8 that I was truly helpless. For the next 8 years, I brought my lunch. For the next 8 years, he took this as a personal challenge to make my life a living hell. My lunches were stolen, my glasses were broken, my things were vandalized, and my friends and I were tormented by the ever-present shadow of Marcus Hines. I did make friends, of course, but many people avoided me simply because I had elicited the ire of Marcus. He was a constant presence in my life. He was always there, always looming, always waiting for his next opportunity to show me what I was, his constant victim. I never owned anything that he didn't try to destroy or take away from me. I never liked a girl that he didn't immediately woo and dump in a semester. Marcus made it his business to have anything that I wanted but couldn't afford, so he could rub it in my face. I kept hoping, just as Mother had always taught me, that karma would catch up with him, and his actions would be punished by the ever-present force of cosmic justice. It seemed, however, that karma was not on my side. As we grew, Marcus became the darling of whatever school he attended, and I became known as a bit of a weirdo. I was a quiet kid. I liked to write. My grades were fine, but I was an introvert, and I didn't like to show off in class. Marcus, on the other hand, was known and loved by all. I quickly learned that this was how he got away with his bullying. Marcus was large, imposing, but he had a way about him that endeared him to adults. I would never admit it to him, but he was also smart. He never had trouble with grades, never had to study for tests, and seemed to succeed with only minimal effort. He played sports through school and thrived on the field just as much as he did in the classroom. By the time we were seniors, he had a football scholarship that would let him go to nearly any school he wanted. He was a typical all-American student, and the world was his oyster. I hated him, especially after what he did to me. I had spent 3 years with one goal in mind, having a seat on the student council at my senior year. It would look great on my college transcripts, alongside my volunteer work and debate team presence. Also, I thought I could actually make a difference for some of the unheard students at the school. On a deeper level, I realized it might also bring me out of my shell and change me a little before leaving this whole experience behind and going on to college. I had lived my life as an introvert, not really wanting to know anyone outside my circle of friends. Senior year was my chance to really experience what would become the best years of my life, or so they said. Maybe putting myself out there would change me a little, perhaps even for the better. I had such high hopes back then. I had campaigned, talked to a few of my fellow students, and felt that I had my finger on the pulse of what they wanted in a councilman. I seemed a shoo-in for the empty seat. That wasn't until Marcus realized how much I wanted it. That's when he joined the race. Suddenly, his flyers were in every hall, his posters plastered over mine. His talking points were very similar to mine too, and his platform was nearly identical to my own. He could say what he wanted to his constituents, but his goal seemed to be yet again taking the one thing that I wanted. He'd been trying and failing to throw me off my game for weeks, trying to get in my head and make me drop out of the election before the upcoming candidacy speech, before the student body voted for their representation. As he approached, I wondered if he had found the toehold he needed. I closed my laptop as he came to stand over me, not wanting it broken if he was in a mood to break things. His face was possessed of that mixture of wicked glee and childish meanness. He looked like a kid who was about to pull the wings off a butterfly. I guess he was. I had been his caged bug for years, and today was just another chance to practice his sadism on me. He came alone, but I could see several Letterman jackets hovering nearby, watching the show. I was nowhere near as muscular as him, being on the scrawny side, but that hardly mattered to me. Marcus never fought fair if he could help it. "Guess what I did last night?" he shouted, glancing around to see who was watching. My friends, immersed in a game of Magic the Gathering, looked up like startled animals around a watering hole. A predator had arrived, and they wanted to know when the best time to start running would be. "I don't know, Marcus. Something fulfilling and meaningful, but I doubt it," I said, without much interest. Marcus barked out a sarcastic little laugh. "You'd be right there, Four Eyes." He never used my name. It was always Four Eyes, and always in tones of deepest scorn. "I was at a rager last night when I met this fine-looking piece of tail and took her upstairs for a few hours. God, she screamed so loud I thought the cops were going to come. "If you're looking for a high five, I think your boys are hovering somewhere over there," I said, already uninterested in the conversation. I had no idea that his trap had teeth, and he was about to show me just how deep they could cut. "I just thought I'd let you know what a good lay your sister was. Four Eyes." She screamed my name again and again as I had her. The whole cafeteria was paying attention now. I glanced at my friends and saw that their game was forgotten as Marcus laid out his night's activities for me in intimate details. My face reddened, the snickers already beginning, and he loudly proclaimed his activities for all to hear. I was shocked. I was incapable of reacting. I simply wanted to stop existing at that very moment. How could she? How could my own flesh and blood betray me so thoroughly? How many nights had I confided in my family about the abuse I suffered at Marcus's hands? How many times had she seen me demoralized at school by this bully? How could she have done such a thing? I don't know how his story ended. I grabbed my bag and ran into the cafeteria, hiding my streaming eyes as I ran blindly for the exit. Someone yelled at me in the hallway, but I didn't stop. I was outside far sooner than I thought I would be, and I heard a car horn blare as I dashed across the parking lot towards my car. I tossed my bag inside, not even caring about the things inside, and was on the road before I knew quite what was happening. My streaming eyes made it difficult to drive, but I knew I couldn't stay there a moment longer. The emotions roiled inside me, and I felt like I might be sick as I drove the streets. There was rage bubbling inside me, an impotent rage that had been festering for years but had never been fully realized. I hated Marcus, but his actions had been those of a bully seeking a release until this point. It was only then that I realized his intention to hurt. He wasn't content with just hurting me physically anymore. He wanted to break me. I didn't understand his animosity, and I never would. I spent the rest of the day in my room, having a nervous breakdown. My friends didn't text me. No one texted me. As I lay there waiting for someone to reach out to me, I began to feel utterly alone. My anxiety was palpable as I lay in my bed and tried to gain control of myself. Had anyone even noticed I left school? Of course they had. They were just too embarrassed by my outburst to contact me. They didn't want to get caught up in the fallout of my shame. I wouldn't be welcome to sit with my friends anymore. I would be an outcast. My brain reminded me, almost absently, that I could kiss my bid for student council goodbye as well. No one would vote for me now. No one would waste their vote on a loser like me. The candidacy speech was tomorrow. How could I mount that stage with everyone whispering about me? How could I tell them how I would be their voice on the council, with them all laughing at me behind their hands? My mind raced, my pulse raced, and I lay in bed in perpetual anxiety. I must have fallen asleep at some point, my anxiety so bad that I had worn myself out because of it. Because the next thing I knew, someone was knocking on my door. "Hey, Spaz, why'd you leave school?" My blood ran cold. It was her. My sister, Stephanie, was never what you would call a joy. She was 2 years younger than me, a sophomore, but the two of us couldn't have been more different. My sister was the foil to my introvert nature. She was a social butterfly who flew in many circles and knew practically everyone. She was their perfect little girl to my parents. They were utterly unaware of her late-night carousing and extracurricular activities. To them she was an angel, but to me she was just a spoiled brat. She was needy to the point of annoyance, her needs turning to indifference when you needed something from her. She had come by to see what she could gain from my suffering. "Go away," I droned, not wanting to see her. She came in instead. "Heard Marcus spilled the beans about our night last night." I turned towards the wall, ignoring her. "It was just sex. It's not like we're dating or anything. He's cute and I wanted to sleep with him." I turned over angrily to growl at her. "You slept with someone who has made my life a living hell since I was 8 years old. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? You've made me into a laughingstock. How can I go back to school and look at Marcus, knowing that he's been with my freaking sister?" She smirked, not even having the decency to look ashamed. "As if anyone but you cares. Get over yourself. It's my life, and I'll live it any way I want. For the record, he was great, too." She added the last barb before leaving. My mother was furious when she came home from work. Not at my sister, of course. She couldn't believe that people would spread such lies about her perfect little angel. She was furious at me. How could I leave school early? What was I thinking? Didn't I care about my future at all? Skipping classes and being truant was no way to live my life. The sermons went on as we sat around the dinner table. My sister was smug, of course, as I sat there being chastised. Dad went right on eating as though the world were just as bland as it always was. To say that Dad didn't care was an understatement. Dad simply didn't want to involve himself in what he called woman's work, and didn't worry his mind about the matters concerning the children. I had started shoveling my food down, barely tasting it, to escape the table and my mother's howling words. With my plate clean, I asked to leave. She wasn't done yelling at me yet, but I told her that I needed to prepare my speech for tomorrow, which seemed to perk her up a little. She had known that I was running. Hadn't they both told me how small a chance someone like me had of being elected? But as I kept at it, I think she realized how much I wanted this. She released me, threatening bodily harm if she ever heard of me leaving school early again, and I was free to return to my room. I spent the rest of the night in a state of anxious tension. A rainstorm rolled in about midnight, and I found myself tossing and turning in a ball of roiling emotions. I didn't dare go to school tomorrow. Marcus would be waiting there. All those people would know about my shame, and they would all laugh at me. I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back. I couldn't. The lightning lit up the sky, and I started out of my bed, looking at the window. Had I seen something? It was impossible. I was on the second story. There was no way I had seen something at my window. My anxiety was creeping up on me now, and it was making me see things, that was all. As the rain came down, I got up and moved closer to the window. The thunder boomed outside, and I crept towards the glass square like a rat trying to avoid detection. There was nothing there. Why was I so jumpy? There was nothing on the other side of the window, but when the lightning flashed again, I screamed and fell onto the carpet. Something was on the other side of the window, an inky face that had been looking at me, and when it saw me looking, it had smiled. Its teeth had been Colgate white, a stark contrast to its midnight personage, and I felt my breath hitching as I stared at that jet-black window. The rain fell against it like angry stones, and I waited in terror for the next flash of lightning. When it flashed, it was gone, though. I curled into a ball on the floor, closing my eyes and trying to will myself to sleep, but all I could see was the nightmare face. I had seen it for the barest of seconds, but it was imposed on my memories forever. I lay on the floor as the lightning struck outside, too afraid to open my eyes, but too scared to sleep either. My anxiety and fear roiled inside me like a tempest, and I spent the rest of the night huddled on the floor, shuddering. Wake up! I must have dozed off sometime before the sun came up. My mother was standing over me, yelling and slapping at me as the sun shone merrily through the window. My mother was rousing me, telling me I was going to be late. I stirred groggily and went to my closet to get out the clothes I would wear for the speech today. I was too groggy for the anxiety to hit me all at once, but as I started getting dressed, I remembered the roiling pit of dread in my stomach and stopped with my slacks halfway up. I couldn't go to school. I'd have to face the mob alone. My mother came in with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, frowning as she saw me shaking and indecisive. All my excuses, though, fell on deaf ears. I was not missing school today, no matter what was wrong, and that was that. She would take me and drop me off herself if it came to it. I was not ruining my education because of something silly that had happened the day before. People would always be stupid, and I wasn't going to ruin my future over it. In the end, I took the cup of coffee and left just to escape her venom. As I drove, I honestly felt like I might be having a nervous breakdown. The coffee shook in my hand, and if Mom hadn't put it in a to-go cup, I would have undoubtedly spilled it on my pants as I drove. I looked up in time to see the light turn red, slamming on my brakes just a minute too late and getting a nasty look from a jogger running across the road. I tracked her dully with my eyes and jumped when she ran past an overhang near the deli. The coffee flew out of my hand and hit the passenger window, exploding in a caffeine puddle over the glass. The passers-by looked at me concerned as the drops slid down the glass, but I was already running the red light and speeding towards the school. My heart raced and my stomach flipped over, my anxiety about the speech and the bully momentarily forgotten. Under the awning, perched in the shadow, had been two of those oily black things that had appeared in my window the night before. Their skin had oozed with midnight clarity, but their smiles were wide and crazed. As I drove, I thought I could see others, pairs and threesomes, foursomes, all watching me from the shadows of alleys and the dark respites of awnings and doorways. They were following me. They wanted me, but I did not want to be found by them. I had reminded myself not to speed, I had to remind myself to stop at stop signs and red lights. I did not want to be pulled over. I did not want to stop until I was somewhere with people and lights and places to hide from them. At that point, I would have welcomed the jeers of my schoolyard rabble. I pulled into the parking lot just as the first bell rang. The halls were packed, the students making last-minute preparations and finishing their conversations around lockers. But when they recognized me, I heard a definite change in the tempo of the conversations. "Oh my God, isn't his sister the one who... I feel so bad for him. I don't know how he came to school after... Oh man, Marcus totally owned his ass yesterday. Told the whole world his sister's a... And he just ran away." I walked fast, not talking, not stopping, just wanting to get to my homeroom amidst the gale of gossip. I heard someone laugh, but I didn't dare look. It sounded fake anyway, like teasing laughter, more like the canned laughter on TV shows than real laughter. The hallway became a gauntlet, people staring, people laughing. Amongst them, I became sure that I could see those black creatures that had hounded me all the way here. They slipped among them, staying in the shadows, and whoever they touched seemed to smile and titter. I wanted to run. I could feel tears on the verge of breaking the surface, but I didn't want to draw more attention. The laughter was so snide, so fake, that I almost couldn't stand it. It rattled against my nerves, and it made me want to scream. I rounded a corner, still making for my homeroom, and bumped into someone. I threw my hands up defensively, almost certain that it would be one of those tar creatures with their smiling mouths. Instead, it was Miss Cunningham, the assistant principal. She looked put upon, her normally well-maintained pantsuit and lustrous black hair looking rumpled and out of place. I wondered if she, too, hadn't slept well last night. She huffed when she realized who she had run into, and tapped her foot impatiently. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming today. You're speaking second. Marcus was on time, so he gets to speak first, and it starts in 5 minutes. I suggest you hurry." She turned and started for the gymnasium. I could hear that repulsive laughter behind me, heard it creeping up the corridors like a cancerous cloud, and I sped off behind her, not wanting it to catch me. The gym was packed. The entire senior class was assembled, any excuse to miss first period, I supposed, and they were murmuring quietly in the hard bleachers that had been pulled out for the occasion. As I came in, someone noticed me, and the whispering conversations began again. I heard some snickers, felt their stares, and knew that they knew my shame. My stomach was a roil of angry emotions. My brain was befuddled and unsure of what was real anymore. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, my whole life hanging by a fiber before entirely imploding. I had no clue how much worse it could get. "About time you showed up, Four Eyes," Marcus said, looking resplendent in a suit and tie that had clearly been tailored for him. I didn't say anything. My attention was on the crowd. I could see the creatures amongst them, whispering and gnashing those perfect teeth against their ears. Some in the back had begun to chuckle. Some had already started laughing. Those further down were still engaged in their own conversations, unaware of what horror lurked behind them. They just sat in their little peer circles, chatting and living their lives free of the overwhelming stress surrounding me like a cloud. How I envied them. "Look at all the voters you're not going to get, Four Eyes," Marcus said, but I continued to ignore him. As Miss Cunningham mounted the stage, the laughter had already begun in the back. She ignored it, opened the proceedings with a little speech before introducing Marcus to scattered applause. Marcus grinned at me, mouthing that I should watch how it's done before mounting the podium and starting his speech. He got straight to the point. Students wanted more free periods and fewer assemblies that served no purpose. They wanted more pep rallies and car washes, and less information about booster meetings and boring stuff. He said nothing, but he said it well, and he kept it short, so the students would remember it. The applause were scattered again. The laughter in the top row was taking on that mechanical sound that made my sanity scream from the depths of my skull. There were more of them now, the house lights dimming in the dark of the upper bleachers, and the darkness was spreading. Miss Cunningham had to call my name several times before I finally stood up and made my way to the podium. Marcus's grinning face welcomed me from the front row, smiling and inviting me to begin my pathetic speech. I had forgotten my papers, my meticulously crafted note cards, but it hardly mattered. I could no more have read them at this point than I could have spoken Russian. From the podium, I could see the black tar monsters crawling over the crowd, working their way down and bringing the inky darkness with them. The student body needs a person who will represent them, represent their interests on the council, I feel that I heard the rattling of stuttered laughter, and it threw me off even worse. I feel that I can... My eyes were as big as dinner plates. They were smiling at me from within the crowd. Their 2 white teeth were horrifying. Their teeth, too large for their mouths. How did they contain all those teeth? How did they... Mrs. Cunningham was walking towards me, and I'm not sure if she was trying to save me from the shame of making a fool of myself on stage, or she was angry that I had wasted her time. Regardless, she only got about halfway across the stage when she smirked and began to chuckle. I watched her, terror written across my face, as she doubled over and began to erupt in racking gales of full-body laughter. There was laughter behind me, too. The torpor was becoming a single note of canned and emotionless chuckles as it spilled from throats that were no longer their own. I glanced to the side and saw Marcus doubling up, his fingers dragging over his eyes and cheeks and leaving bloody tails behind. The mob was laughing, their laughter dead in uniform, and I felt my sanity unraveling a strand at a time as I backed away from the crowd. My foot found empty air, and I felt the wind knocked out of me as I fell off the stage. Miss Cunningham was tearing at her clothes as she laughed her life away. I scooted backwards, getting my feet under me and running as that terrible laughter chased me. It's the kind of laughter you hear bubbling from the windows of an insane asylum. It's the kind of laughter you hear in hell. I ran then. Ran until I found a door and barreled through it as the maniac drone chased after me. I ran until the school doors opened before me and I was out on the quad, my sneakers making for home. I ran and I ran, the pavement the most substantial thing I'd felt all day. I ran until I found myself on the porch of my house. I banged on the door until my mother opened it, confusion and anger stamped big across her face. Then I collapsed, and I didn't come back to reality for 3 days. When I did, I was in the hospital. That's where I got the whole story from my bleary-eyed mother, who hadn't left my bedside the entire time I'd been here. Everyone in the gym was dead. The police were calling it a gas leak, and the whole city was mourning the loss of so many young people. The doors had been wedged shut, all but the ones I had burst out of. School officials had found everyone inside dead from hyperventilation, including Miss Cunningham. Some had tried to claw their eyes out, had peeled their faces open, but all had succumbed to this terrible tragedy. I said nothing. My sister came to visit, apologizing for how she had hurt me, and extremely thankful that I had been late that day. My mother was suddenly the doting woman I had always wanted. She and my sister were never far from my side, and their attention quickly became claustrophobic. I soaked it in as long as it lasted, though, never wanting it to end. I would never tell anyone about what had happened that day. They all assumed that my lateness had led to my safety, and they would never believe me if I told them the truth. That was 10 years ago. I live on my own now. I have it all. An apartment, a girlfriend, a mediocre job, the whole experience. My mom and sister still call to check on me often. My dad is the same old ambivalent person he always has been, and it's heartwarming to have their love after years of feeling like an outcast in my own home. I felt I had gotten over the event. I felt that I had put it behind me. I don't talk about it outside of therapy, and I like to think that it may make me stronger for having lived through it. My girlfriend knows nothing about it, of course. She knows I had something traumatic happen in my past, but she knows I've moved on, and the less I say about it, the better it is for my mental health. At least, I had gotten over it. Yesterday I received a letter in the mail, a letter from my old high school, a letter for a high school reunion. I looked at the postcard, a glossy picture on the front, and the words on the back with the banner proclaiming, "Welcome back, class of 2010. The front was a picture of the gym as it had been on the day of the event. On the floor was gathered the smiling creatures as they waved and grinned their eternal grins. On the back was written 3 words that sent chills down my spine even now. See you soon. It's been a rough couple of days at Grandpa's house. As the summer creeps across the land, the rains have been heavier than usual this season. It seems like the grass needs cutting every weekend, and this weekend it looked more like hay than grass. It's my own fault. Grandpa and I have been busy with the flea market stall lately,
and the house looks pretty shabby because of it. So, one Sunday morning, I took it upon myself to put the house and the yard in order. The grass in the yard was nearly as high as I was, and it seemed the best place to start. When I came to live with Grandpa, he showed me the mower he had in the shed, and I remember rolling my eyes at the ancient old thing. It was a push mower, something Grandpa called a Flintstone, and after a few days of shoving it around, I begged him to buy something with a motor. Grandpa laughed about it, but there was a brand new push mower in the shed next time I went to go mow the grass. As I set to work now, I kinda wished I'd asked for a rider instead. I was pushing the hateful engine through the tall grass when I hit something and nearly fell over the front bars. Looking up, I wondered how I had missed the sparkling bottles that protruded from the scraggy grass. Grandpa's yard was full of such weird ornaments, gnomes and bird baths and things like the tinkling sculpture I had run into. It wasn't until I pulled the mower back, though, that I heard the cracking and realized I had damaged it. The glass around the sculpture may have been high, but the grass around it was short and freshly cut. When the bottles collided with the ground, they burst in a small explosion of angry glass. I reached out a hand, meaning to right the thing, and was suddenly enveloped by the worst pain of my life. I looked down to see if I'd stepped in glass, wobbling around as I slapped at my skin. It felt like glass shards were piercing me all over, and I worried for a moment that I had stirred up some ground wasps. It was every piece of glass from the broken bottles was making its way into my skin. I wobbled towards the house before falling onto the freshly cut lawn. When I came back to myself, Grandpa was standing over me. "You okay, son?" "Yeah," I groaned, my skin still burning as I slapped at it. I guess the sun got to me or something. I remembered the thing that I had broken and pointed at the remains of the shattered sculpture. "Sorry, Grandpa, I think I broke your sculpture or something." He looked over at the pile of glass and wood, and the color drained from his shriveled face. "Oh no," came a whisper, and it sounded as frail as a dried leaf. For a man his age, Grandpa gets around surprisingly well. Today he was nearly running as he went over to the thing. He went to the weird whatever it was and lifted it up so he could inspect the bottles. I got to my feet and came up behind him, and it was only then that I noticed the colors. Most were blue, but there were some green ones and some brown ones, maybe a clear one or two. Grandpa sucked in a hissing breath, and I could see that the ends of many were jagged and smashed. "This is bad, son," he said, and when he looked at me, his eyes were full of sorrow. "What do you mean? I see you break bottles almost every night of the week." "Yeah, but not these bottles," Grandpa hedged, lifting the thing and placing it back into the ground. He set about replacing the broken bottles and putting them in a nearby wheelbarrow. I reached out to help him, but he caught my wrist and pushed it away politely. I watched him go about his work, and when the wheelbarrow was full, he wheeled it beside the house and out of sight. He came back with a box that rattled a little and started walking around replacing the bottles I'd broken. "Grandpa, what's going on?" "Well, son, you broke my bottle tree." "Your what?" I asked, unfamiliar with the word. "Dear Lord, have you never heard of a bottle tree?" he asked, looking at me as though scandalized. "No, I don't believe I've ever heard of one till today." This seemed to anger him even more. "Has my daughter forgotten everything? She doesn't teach you about bottle trees or crickets at Christmas or anything." He put the last bottle on a little too hard, and when the neck broke and sent it spilling to the ground, he picked it up and threw it in the woods. I thought you said—" "Doesn't matter, that was a clean bottle anyway." "Clean?" I asked, but Grandpa was in a hurry. He had begun stomping off towards the house, muttering under his breath as he mounted the stairs. I stared after him, catching him easily, but he put out a bony hand to stop me before I could take a single step onto the porch. "Oh no, not yet. No way you're bringing them spirits into my house. You wait here till I get my bag. Make yourself useful while you wait and bury those bottles in the side yard." I asked him why, but he just said there would be plenty of time to talk while we walked to the river. With no answer forthcoming, I shrugged and set about burying the bottles in the wheelbarrow. By the time they were all buried, Grandpa had returned with a satchel and a determined look on his face. "Come on, then. Best we get started." "Get started with what?" I asked, feeling my frustration mounting. I had broken some weird piece of art that just sat out in the yard. What the hell was going on? The way he sounded, it was like I had desecrated the altar at the Baptist church. "You're cleansing. We need to do it before nightfall. Otherwise, things may get very bad for you." He had turned to go, his heading taking us towards the woods, but when I threw the shovel down, he jumped a foot in the air. "But why? Why do I need to be cleansed? What the hell did I do?" Grandpa sighed, his eyes already judging the sun as he thought about the best way to explain. "If you come with me, I'll tell you everything along the way, but we have to hurry. What's waiting for you tonight would make the cricket I had in my head look like a fond memory." I was left with very few options, and Grandpa had never steered me wrong before. I followed him into the woods with only the slightest hesitation. Once we were beneath the canopy of the Georgia woods, I felt safe enough to ask him what was so important about the bottle tree I had wrecked. "You remember when I taught you about spirits and how to get them out of your house? Well, a bottle tree is a good way to do just that. Oftentimes, spirits travel from the place where they were released, scared and angry, and that's how they become trapped in people's houses. The bottles confuse them, though. They give them somewhere else to go. They see the blue bottles and think that they're going towards the sky, or the green bottles and believe they're going towards the trees. Once inside, however, the spirit is trapped, and it can't get out." "How exactly are they dumb enough to get stuck in a bottle?" I asked. Grandpa laughed, stepping under a branch that I was forced to shove aside. "The spirit is confused after being ejected from the body. Not all spirits become dark. Some are just good people trying to move on, who get a little lost along the way. Whatever the case, the spirits get trapped in the bottle, and when the sun rises, they burn up. Spirits can't remain on the living world once the sun rises, and they must be safe in their graves or get cast out." We crossed the first stream we came to, but Grandpa waded through and kept going. Clearly, this was not the river he was looking for, so we plunged on into the Appalachian wilderness. Granddad seemed to know where we were going, at least, and as the sun began to make its way in the other direction, I followed him. "So, if the sun dissolves them, what exactly do I have to worry about?" "Well, the spirit's remains coat the inside of the bottle. They're gone, but not quite forgotten. There's an old story about a woman whose husband had a bottle tree, and when she washed the bottles, she loosed vengeful spirits into their house. Lord knows why she wanted to wash old bottles, but for all intents and purposes, you've done something very similar." We came to another river, this one full of snowmelt, but he only looked for a fallen tree so he could cross. "What are we looking for out here exactly?" I asked as Grandpa shoved over a small deadfall and shimmied across. "We're going to a place your grandma showed me. It was where she got the water that healed the cricket out of me, and I feel it will be sufficient to draw the spirits out of you, too." "And what makes you think there are spirits in me?" "I found you in the yard, son. You can't tell me that you didn't feel something." I couldn't deny it, and that was all the answer he needed. "How do you know all this anyway?" I asked him, my hand sticky with pine tar as I finished scurrying over the deadfall. "Don't tell me you broke a bottle tree in your youth." "Nope," Grandpa said, wiping his own hands on the grass. "But a cousin of mine did." "Oh, what happened to him?" "Well, he didn't die, but he probably wished he had at the time." I sighed. "I guess we'll need something to do till we get there. Let's have another story, Gramps." Grandpa chuckled. "You may regret that after you hear it." As the sun sank lower and lower, my legs growing sorer and sorer, Grandpa began his tale. "His name was Clint, and he was my mother's sister's son." "How many cousins do you have exactly?" I asked. "Well, let's see. Your great-grandmother had 8 siblings, and your great-grandfather had 7, so—" He pretended to count on his fingers before turning and saying, "Way too damn many. May I continue or not?" I told him to proceed, and so he began. "Cousin Clint was visiting for a few weeks. We were exploring the woods around where I lived. Clint was from the woods too, but his mother lived in Arkansas, and his woods were a little different than mine. He wasn't a fool. He knew his way around the woodlands, but his upbringing had lacked the spiritual nature that my grandmother had exposed me to. So, when we came across the old Ruckman Cemetery, Clint merely saw a boneyard to explore. We were tossing a ball back and forth, a little more than the guts of a baseball, really, when the dirty stone perimeter of the family cemetery rose up from the woods like old teeth. The Ruckmans were an old family that had once lived in that part of the holler. They were gone by the time I was born, their farmland reclaimed by the forest, but their headstones remained, as did some stone fence that marked their burial ground. Aside from those crumbling stones, several bottle trees were also in attendance. Some of them were little more than crumbling relics from the farm days, but many still stood displaying their bottles proudly. Clint knew what they were. His mother had bottle trees in her garden, too. It was clear, though, that he didn't believe in them. They were just something superstitious to him, and as he tossed the ball back and forth, he walked closer and closer to the low stone gate. I told him not to get too close. I told him that all kinds of nasty things might attach themselves to him if he got too close, but he just laughed and said that was stupid. Dead things stay dead. That's what they do. Before I could disagree, he told me to throw a long one and ran. I launched the ball in a high arc, but I saw what was about to happen before Clint did. He was running backwards, and he never saw the bottle tree that he slammed into. It shattered underneath him when he fell on it, and I ran to help him before he cut himself too badly. When Clint screamed, I assumed he had gotten into the glass. When he started to shake, I knew it was something else. I pulled him off the bottle tree as best I could, and was surprised to find that he didn't have a scratch on him. The way he was flopping around, I thought he was probably hurt bad. When I saw no blood, though, I wondered what exactly had made him scream like that. He came around soon enough, and when I asked him what had happened, he said he must have hit his head. God, it hurt so much, though. I don't know what it was, but it hurt like fire. I checked him over, but we were losing the sun by then. It was late afternoon, and we needed to get home before supper got cold. So we set out, Clint stumbling a little as we headed for home, and me keeping an eye on him. He seemed a little woozy, but I didn't think much of it as we made our way over the familiar hills and through the hollers. It began as an itch. Clint began to scratch his arms, slapping at himself as though bugs were on him. I asked him if he were okay. He said it felt like something was biting him, and he wondered if maybe he hadn't blundered into some poison ivy. The further we went, the more his itching became pain. Clint staggered as the sun rode low, saying he must have gotten some glass into him when he fell. He said it felt like his insides were on fire, and I had to throw an arm over him to see if I could help him get back to the house so someone could look him over. He began to scream again the closer we got to home, and as we burst into the yard, I could already feel my shirt getting wet with something. I looked down to find him oozing blood from a dozen wounds. I let him drop to the ground, and as he fell, he began to scream and writhe. It was as if he had fallen on a porcupine, and when I ran from my mother, I wasn't sure I would see him alive again. Mama came on the run, Daddy too, and my aunt was right behind them as they came to see what was wrong with Clint. His skin oozed blood, like small red rivulets, and we could do little but watch him bleed with no idea how to stop it. Until, that is, Mama told me to go get Grandma, and I went on the run. The longer I listened to the story, the more scared I became. When he first spoke about the itch, the sun was still high in the west, but as it sank lower and lower, I started to feel like ants were crawling on me. I slapped and checked myself for bugs, but Grandpa just went right on with his story. If he noticed at all, I mean. I couldn't understand what was going on, but the longer we walked, the more I felt like the itch was becoming a burning under my skin. At first it was like a sunburn. It itched and burned and was irritated, but the feeling wasn't too bad. It made the feeling of my jeans rubbing against my legs truly irritating, though. And my shirt felt like it was made out of twine instead of cotton. Was this how Clint had felt as he left the graveyard for home? When would I start to bleed out of every pore? How long would I have before I could no longer control my legs and Grandpa would have to carry me? "Are you okay, son?" Grandpa asked, and I nodded and told him to go on. Grisly story as it was all that was keeping me distracted from the itch and the building of the burning. Grandma met me at the door. I never thought of it as a kid, but Grandma always seemed to have some sort of sixth sense about these things. I thought then that it was just how old people were, but now I understand that it was her way. She knew when she was needed, and she was ready to help when the need arose. She had a shoulder bag on, this one that I'm wearing actually, and she told me to show her the way. I led her back to the house and was glad to hear Clint screaming when I got there. Grandma looked at him and asked what had happened out in the woods today. "Nothing," I told her. "We were playing with a ball and exploring the woods, and then But that's when I remembered the bottle tree. Clint fell on a bottle tree over by the Ruckman's cemetery. Grandma was in her bag in an instant. 'Hold him down. He's not going to like this.' They held him down, none of them asking questions, as she called me over and showed me the bottle of river water. I say a bottle, but it was more like a pitcher. It held a large wax seal on top, and when she uncorked it, the water shimmered like a trout's scales. From a stream I know of. I'll show you sometime," she promised, before turning and dumping the water over Clint. He stilled in his squirming for a moment, at least until the glass started breaking his skin. He stopped then, and I realized we had arrived. "It, may be best if you not listen to the next part before we're done." I had itched and burned for the last hour of the hike, but the sight of the river took my breath away. It was like looking at a fish as it wriggled on the ground, its gorgeous scales shimmering in the dying daylight. It called me as I watched it flow, begging me to drown myself in it. "Climb in," Grandpa said, his eyes straying to the burning line of the sky. "Climb in while there's still daylight." I started to take my shirt off, but Grandpa sighed. "There's no time for that." For someone so old, his hands were oddly strong as he shoved me into the river. Just like Clint, the water seemed to stop my burning and itching, but I could feel something else just below my skin. Then, the pain that flashed across my body made the pain from earlier seem like a daydream. It felt like knives were being born from my flesh. It felt like someone was pulling teeth out of my skin. I can't properly explain what it felt like, but I watched as the shards of colored glass slid out of me. They came out like sewing needles, some of the slivers looking as long as my pinky finger, and as they came out, they dissolved into sparkling motes of color. My breath felt trapped inside me, my hands shaking as they fought against the current that tried to pull me down. I felt stabbed 1,000 times and was not aware when it finally ended. I passed out well before then. I woke up by a fire, my clothes drier and my body no longer aching. "I didn't think you were ever gonna let go of that bank," Grandpa said, making me jump a little. "I'd wager you still have some soil under your nails." I lay there, still trying to come to terms with what I'd seen. It appeared that Appalachia was full of more mysteries than I could imagine. "You did well. I wasn't sure you would, but I don't think the spirits in my bottle tree were as bad as Clint's. The graveyard had existed for hundreds of years or more, and there was no telling what sort of hateful spirits had gotten holed up in there." Did he live?" I asked, a little afraid of how weak I sounded. "He did, and thankfully he didn't remember any of it. I suspect that he blocked it all out, but he wouldn't go near a cemetery for the rest of his life. He was cremated when he died. He refused to let them put him in the family plot." He looked up as a log popped, watching the embers drift up as he smiled contentedly to himself. "This reminds me of the night I met a Sasquatch out here. I was out here drinking but I never even heard how it began. I was snoring before he even got past the setup, hoping this was the longest day I'd ever have in the Georgia hills.